A little girl walks into an emergency room alone during the worst blizzard this county has seen in 40 years. She is 8 years old. Her name is Lila Cross. Beneath an oversized hoodie 3 sizes too big, bruises map her body like a second skin. Ribs, arms, the back of her neck. But it is not the bruises that stop veteran ER nurse Evelyn Hart, cold in the middle of a 12-hour shift. It is the child's eyes. Flat, quiet, already finished. The eyes of someone who has accepted that tonight might be the last night. And somewhere out in that storm, the man who put those marks on her is already coming to take her back. What happens next will shake an entire town and bring the thunder of something no one expected. If this story hits you, drop a like right now, comment what city you are watching from, and stay all the way to the end. You are not ready for where this goes. The snow came sideways that night across Ridgecrest County, the kind of wind that turned visibility into a rumor and froze the breath inside your chest before it left your mouth. Highway 9 was a white void. The only things moving on it were ghosts and bad decisions. The Ridgecrest General Emergency Room sat at the edge of town like an afterthought, a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that buzzed loud enough to fill the silence between traumas. It was the kind of hospital that ran on coffee, understaffing, and the quiet stubbornness of people who had nowhere better to go. Evelyn Hart had been on shift since 6 that morning, 18 hours now. Her scrubs smelled like antiseptic and someone else's blood. Her lower back had stopped sending pain signals 2 hours ago and moved straight into numbness, which she knew from experience was worse. She was 53 years old, divorced twice, 2 grown sons who called on holidays if she was lucky. She had seen 13 years of night shifts turn her hair from dark brown to steel gray, and she had stopped caring about that around year 9. What she had not stopped caring about was the work, the bodies that came through those sliding doors, the ones nobody else wanted to look at. She was refilling her coffee, her 6th cup, black, no sugar, the pot so old it tasted like rust, when the automatic doors hissed open and let in a blade of frozen air. No ambulance, no parent, no adult at all, just a child. The girl stood in the entryway like something the storm had coughed up. An oversized gray hoodie hung past her knees, the sleeves swallowing her hands entirely. Her sneakers were soaked through, one sole peeling away from the toe. Snow clung to her hair in clumps that were already melting under the fluorescent glare, sending thin trails of water down her face like tears she was not crying. She was not crying. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. A child that age alone, in a blizzard, should have been sobbing, screaming, calling for someone. This girl stood perfectly still and said nothing. Evelyn set the coffee down. She moved slowly, the way you approach something wounded that might bolt. She had learned that pace from years of working with trauma patients. Never fast, never loud, never from directly above. She crouched 3 feet away and kept her hands visible. "Hey there, sweetheart. My name's Evelyn. Can you tell me yours?" The girl's eyes tracked her. Not with fear exactly, with calculation. Measuring whether this adult was a threat or just another person who would eventually look away. "Lila," the girl said. Her voice was so quiet it barely registered above the hum of the heating vent. "Lila, that's a pretty name. Are you hurt anywhere?" No answer, but Evelyn did not need one. The hoodie had shifted when the girl moved her arm, and beneath it Evelyn caught the edge of something dark and swollen along the child's forearm. Not a fall. Not an accident. The shape was wrong for that. It was the shape of fingers. An adult's grip, pressed hard enough to leave its signature in purple and black. Evelyn's stomach turned, but her face stayed even. 18 years. You learned to hold the horror behind your teeth. "Lila, I need to take a look at you. Is that okay? Nobody's going to do anything you don't want." The girl studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a movement so small it could have been a shiver. In exam room 4, under the pale light that made everyone look half dead, the full picture revealed itself. Bruises along both forearms, a welt across the upper back that had scabbed and reopened at least once, 2 ribs that made the girl flinch when Evelyn palpated them, possibly cracked, definitely brutalized, an older mark on her collarbone, yellowish green, weeks healed, a timeline of violence written across a body that weighed maybe 50 pounds. Evelyn had seen abuse before, more times than she could count, But something about this child was different. It was the stillness. Most abused children cried when you found the injuries, or they flinched, or they made up stories about falling off bikes and walking into doors. Lila did none of that. She sat on the exam table with her feet dangling and her hands folded in her lap and watched Evelyn catalog the damage with the patience of someone who had been through this inventory many times before and knew it changed nothing. "Lila?" Evelyn said carefully, pulling off her gloves and sitting down so their eyes were level. "Who did this to you?" Silence. The fluorescent tube above them flickered once. "If he finds me," Lila whispered, "he'll finish it this time." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Evelyn felt them in her chest, not as surprise, but as confirmation of something she had already understood the moment the girl walked in alone. This was not a child seeking help. This was a child who had run out of options and ended up here because the storm had closed every other road. "Who is he, Lila?" "Wade?" "Wade who?" "My stepdad." Evelyn exhaled through her nose. She reached for the phone on the wall and dialed CPS. The line rang 9 times. An automated message told her the office was closed due to weather conditions and to call back during normal business hours. She hung up and tried the county sheriff's non-emergency line. Same result. She tried dispatch. A tired voice told her all units were responding to weather-related incidents and that she could file a report in the morning. She set the phone back in its cradle and stared at it for a moment, like it had personally betrayed her. The system. The great invisible machine that was supposed to catch children before they hit the ground. Closed for weather. Sorry for the inconvenience. Please hold. She turned back to Lila. "You're safe here tonight. Nobody is taking you anywhere." Lila looked at her with those flat, ancient eyes. "You don't know him," she said. 2 hours later, Evelyn understood what the girl meant. The automatic doors slammed open hard enough to rattle the frame, and Wade Mercer walked into the emergency room like he owned the county. He was 6'3", wide across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts. A crooked nose broken more than once, small eyes set too deep, a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum. His coat was expensive, too expensive for Ridgecrest, and beneath it Evelyn caught the glint of a belt buckle the size of a fist. He smelled like whiskey and wet leather, and something sharper underneath, something chemical and wrong. He walked straight to the front desk where a young intake clerk named Danny was pretending to organize files. "I'm here for my daughter," Wade said. Not a question, a statement of ownership. Danny looked up. His face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Recognition, then fear, then a careful blankness that Evelyn had seen on the faces of people who had already decided not to get involved. "Mr. Mercer, let me check." "You don't need to check anything. She's 8, brown hair, came in alone. I know she's here." Danny's eyes flicked to Evelyn, who was standing in the hallway 15 feet away. She saw the plea in them, the silent begging. "Please don't make me be the one who says no to this man." Evelyn walked forward, her back hurt, her feet hurt. She had not eaten since noon, but something in her spine straightened as she moved, some old iron she did not know she still had. "Mr. Mercer, I'm the attending nurse. Lila presented with significant injuries tonight. We've documented everything and we're obligated to—" "Obligated." Wade cut her off without raising his voice. He did not need to raise his voice. His voice was already a weapon. Low, flat, with the careful precision of a man who had learned exactly how much pressure to apply before something broke. "She fell off her bike 3 days ago. Kids fall. You know that." "In January? On ice?" "She was in the garage. What are you, a detective now?" Evelyn held his stare. She could feel Danny behind her trying to become invisible. She could feel the security guard, a retired cop named Phil who was 62 and had a bad knee, hovering near the vending machines and finding something very interesting about the floor tiles. "I've contacted Child Protective Services," Evelyn said. It was technically true. She had called. Nobody had answered. But she said it like a wall, like a barrier she was placing between this man and the girl in exam room 4. Wade's eyes narrowed, not with anger, with amusement, and that was worse. "CPS," he repeated. "You called CPS on me." He leaned forward slightly, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and his voice dropped to something barely above a murmur. "You have any idea who you're talking to? You have any idea what I do in this town?" Evelyn did not answer, but she did not step back either. Behind her, Phil the security guard had developed a sudden and urgent need to check the parking lot. Danny had vanished entirely. Two other nurses at the station were looking at charts with the intense focus of people who had decided this was not their problem. She was alone. Wade smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. The kind that said, "I know you're alone, and you know you're alone, and we both know what that means." "I'll be back in the morning," he said, "with my lawyer, and we're going to have a real conversation about what happens to nurses who overstep." He turned and walked out. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him. The temperature in the lobby seemed to rise by 10 degrees. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her hands shaking at her sides, and felt the full weight of what she had just done. She had stalled a man who scared an entire emergency room into silence. She had bought maybe 8 hours, maybe less. And when those hours were up, the system she had called would either not show up, or show up too late, or show up and do exactly nothing, the way it always did in places like Ridgecrest, in counties where certain men had certain connections and certain things stayed buried. She walked back to exam room 4. Lila was sitting exactly where she had left her, hands still folded, eyes still flat. "He was here," Lila said. Not a question. "He left." "He'll come back." Evelyn sat down across from her and felt something crack inside her chest. Not bone. Something older than that. Something that had been holding for 18 years of night shifts and lost cases and children she could not save. "Not tonight," she said. Then she picked up her personal phone and scrolled through contacts she had not opened in over a decade. Past the names of colleagues and ex-husbands and distant relatives, past the numbers she kept meaning to delete, down to a name she had almost forgotten. Boone Ryder. She had known him once, years ago, before the scars and before the silence. Back when he was still Tommy Ryder's kid brother, 18 and angry and heading for the Marines because there was nothing in Ridgecrest worth staying for. She had been the ER nurse who stitched his knuckles after a bar fight the night before he shipped out. He had been quiet even then, the kind of quiet that came from growing up in a house where noise meant danger. She had heard he came back different. They all came back different. But Boone came back the kind of different that made people cross the street. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A medical discharge nobody talked about. And somewhere in the years after, he had found or been found by the Iron Wolves. A motorcycle brotherhood that operated in the gray spaces between the law and the darkness, running a compound deep in the pine forests north of the county line. Rumors followed them the way smoke follows fire. But Evelyn had heard other rumors too, quieter ones, about the Iron Wolves showing up at custody hearings, standing outside courtrooms, escorting children to school when the adults who were supposed to protect them could not or would not. No press, no cameras, no credit. Just leather and engine noise and a wall of scarred men who had decided that whatever they had lost overseas or in prison or in the wreckage of their own lives, they could still stand between a child and the thing that wanted to hurt her. She had never called the number. She had kept it the way people keep fire extinguishers, not because they plan to use them, but because some part of them knows the day will come. Tonight, the day came. She pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. "Yeah." A voice like gravel dragged across concrete. No greeting, no name, just that single syllable, already alert at 2 in the morning. "Boone, it's Evelyn Hart from Ridgecrest General." A pause. She heard wind on the other end, or maybe breathing. With Boone, it was hard to tell. "I remember," he said. "I have a girl here, 8 years old. She walked in alone during the storm. Her stepfather—" Evelyn paused, glanced at the door, lowered her voice. "His name is Wade Mercer. He's already been here demanding her back. Security won't stand up to him. CPS isn't answering. Sheriff's office is shut down for the weather. I've got maybe 6 hours before he comes back with a lawyer and this whole thing disappears." Another pause. Longer this time. "How bad?" Boone asked. Evelyn closed her eyes. "Bad enough that she told me he'd finish it this time." She heard something on the other end. Not words, but a shift. The creak of a chair, the sound of boots hitting a floor. Movement. "Don't let her out of your sight," Boone said. "We're coming." The line went dead. Evelyn sat in the silence of exam room 4 and listened to the storm rattle the windows. Lila had curled onto her side on the exam table, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes still open. Still watching, still calculating the distance between herself and every door. "Someone's coming," Evelyn said softly. "Someone who can help." Lila did not respond. She had heard that sentence before. From teachers. From neighbors. From the one social worker who had visited the house and left after Wade showed her the clean kitchen and the fresh sheets on Lila's bed and the smile he kept in a drawer for exactly these occasions. Someone who can help. The most dangerous sentence in the English language, because it carried a promise that adults almost never kept. 40 minutes passed. Evelyn made another pot of coffee. She checked Lila's vitals. She wrote notes she knew might become evidence. She tried CPS again. Still closed. She tried the sheriff again. A different dispatcher this time, who sounded younger and more confused, and told her that domestic situations required an in-person report filed during business hours unless there was an active threat to life. "There is an active threat to life," Evelyn said. "Ma'am, is the individual currently present at the hospital?" "No, but..." "Then I'd recommend filing the report in the morning. We're stretched thin with the storm." She hung up and pressed her forehead against the wall and breathed. The system. Every joint rusted. Every gear grinding the wrong way. Built to process paperwork. Not to save a child at 2:30 in the morning during a blizzard in a county where the man who beat her had friends in places that mattered. At 2:47 a.m., Evelyn heard it. Low at first, buried under the wind. A vibration more than a sound. The kind of frequency that traveled through the ground before it reached your ears. She walked to the lobby windows and looked out into the parking lot, where the snow was falling so thick it looked like static on an old television. Headlights cut through the white. 1 pair. Then 3. Then 10. Then more than she could count. They came in a staggered line, their engines a collective growl that shook the glass in the window frames. Harleys and heavy cruisers, their chrome dulled by ice and road salt, their riders hunched against the wind like men who had ridden through worse and would ride through worse again. They filled the parking lot in silence. No revving, no showboating, just the controlled precision of people who had done this before. Engines died one by one in sequence, and then there was only the sound of boots crunching on packed snow as 30-some men and a handful of women dismounted and took position. They did not come inside. They stood in the parking lot, spread in a loose perimeter around the emergency room entrance, their leather cuts dark with melted snow, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. Some leaned against their bikes. Some crossed their arms. One woman with a shaved head and a neck tattoo lit a cigarette and cupped the flame against the wind, her eyes scanning the access road with the patience of a sniper. They were not threatening anyone. They were not blocking anything. They were simply there in the way that a mountain is simply there. Immovable, undeniable, and utterly indifferent to whether you found it convenient. The front doors opened and one man walked in alone. He was tall. Not Wade Mercer tall, but tall in a different way, a way that had nothing to do with inches and everything to do with the space he occupied in a room. His face was a map of damage. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, thin and white and old. Another crossed the bridge of his nose. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. Gray, cold, deep enough to drown in. His leather cut bore the iron wolf's patch across the back, a snarling wolf's head over crossed wrenches, and beneath it a bottom rocker that read simply, Founder. His hands were scarred across every knuckle. His boots left wet prints on the floor that somehow seemed heavier than Wade Mercer's had. He looked at Evelyn. He did not smile. He did not extend a hand. He just looked at her, and in that look was the full weight of whatever he had carried home from 3 tours and however many years of living in the spaces between the law and the void. "Where is she?" Boone said. Evelyn led him to exam room 4. She opened the door slowly. Lila was still curled on her side, still watching, still calculating. When Boone stepped into the room, the girl's body went rigid. Her fingers clenched the edge of the exam table. Her breathing shortened. A man. A large man. In a doorway. The oldest equation in her world. Man plus doorway plus night equals pain. Boone stopped 4 feet from the bed. He did not move closer. He did not crouch down or soften his voice into that syrupy tone adults used when they wanted children to trust them before they had earned it. He simply stood there and let her look at him, let her measure the threat, let her calculate the distance to the door behind him and the window to her left, and every exit she had already mapped, because that was what children like her did. They mapped exits the way other children mapped playgrounds. "My name's Boone," he said. His voice was the same gravel she had heard on the phone, but quieter now, turned down the way you turn down an engine in a residential neighborhood. Not gentle, reduced. "Nobody here is going to touch you. Nobody's going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. You understand?" Lila watched him. Her eyes moved from his face to his scarred hands to the patches on his leather cut and back to his face, reading him the way she read every adult, looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden cost. "You're a biker," she said. Flat. Not a question. "Yeah. Bikers are bad." "Some are." He did not argue with it, did not correct her, just accepted the statement and left it sitting between them like a card laid face up on a table. "Some aren't. You'll figure out which one I am." Something shifted in Lila's face. Not trust. Trust was a language she had forgotten years ago, but something adjacent to it. Curiosity, maybe. The faint surprise of hearing an adult say something honest instead of something reassuring. Boone pulled a chair from the corner of the room. Metal legs scraped linoleum. He sat down 5 feet from the bed, leaned back, crossed his arms, and settled into a stillness so complete it seemed rehearsed, except it was not rehearsed. It was the stillness of a man who had spent months in observation posts in places where movement meant death, and who had brought that patience home with him like a scar that did not show on the skin. "I'm going to sit here for a while," he said. "That all right?" Lila did not answer, but she did not tell him to leave. And after a few minutes, her grip on the edge of the table loosened, and her breathing slowed, and her eyes stopped tracking the door every 10 seconds. Outside, the iron wolves held their perimeter. Snow piled on their shoulders. Ice formed on their beards and on the chrome of their bikes. None of them moved. None of them spoke above a murmur. They watched the access road and the parking lot entrances and the far edge of the tree line where the county highway disappeared into the storm. And they waited with the terrible patience of people who had learned to wait in places far worse than this. Inside exam room 4, Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched Boone sitting motionless beside the bed, where a battered child was slowly, against every instinct in her body, allowing herself to close her eyes in the presence of a stranger. And Evelyn realized she was witnessing something she had never seen in 18 years of emergency medicine. A child who had been taught by violence to never let her guard down was letting her guard down. Not because anyone had told her it was safe, not because anyone had promised her anything, but because the man sitting in the chair beside her was radiating something she had never encountered before. A silence that did not feel like absence, but like shelter. Evelyn stepped back into the hallway and leaned against the wall and pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed. Through her fingers, through the shaking, through the 18 years of cases that ended wrong. She checked her phone. 3:15 a.m. In 5 hours, Wade Mercer would return with his lawyer. CPS might answer or might not. The sheriff might file a report or might not. The system that was supposed to protect Lila Cross would either grind to life or remain frozen. And the odds were not in the girl's favor, because the odds in Ridgecrest County had never been in the favor of small, bruised children whose stepfathers knew the right people. But now there were 30 iron wolves standing in a blizzard outside the emergency room, and one sitting silently beside a sleeping child. And for the first time since Lila had walked through those automatic doors, Evelyn allowed herself to think the word that she had trained herself never to use in situations like this. Hope. At 4 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she did not recognize. She opened it. 2 words. "Mercer is connected to Judge Halloran. The custody file has already been sealed." Evelyn stared at the screen. Her blood went cold. If the custody file was already sealed, it meant someone had moved before Lila even reached the hospital. It meant the fix was in before the girl walked through the storm. It meant Wade Mercer did not just have friends in the system, he was the system. And the only people standing between him and that child were an exhausted nurse and a brotherhood of outlaws that the law itself would never recognize. Evelyn looked through the exam room window at Boone, still motionless in his chair, and at Lila, finally asleep. Then she looked at her phone again. The message had no sender name, no signature, just those two sentences and a silence that felt like a door closing. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, beyond the iron wolves standing like statues in the snow, beyond the frozen highway and the dark pines bending under the weight of ice, a phone rang in a house on the nice side of town. A man answered it, listened, said 3 words, "Handle it quietly." And in that moment, the war for Lila Cross had already begun. And the people fighting for her did not even know how deep the enemy ran. The compound sat 11 miles north of the county line, buried in a stretch of pine forest so dense the trees swallowed sound. No signs on the road, no mailbox, just a gravel turnoff between 2 dead oaks that looked like every other gravel turnoff on Route 14 unless you knew what you were looking for. The Iron Wolves had built it over 15 years from salvage and stubbornness. A main lodge constructed from reclaimed lumber and corrugated steel, a row of smaller cabins along the eastern tree line, a workshop with 3 hydraulic lifts and enough tools to rebuild anything with an engine, and a mess hall that smelled permanently of bacon grease and diesel fuel regardless of what was actually cooking. A chain-link fence ringed the perimeter, topped with razor wire that glinted like teeth in the winter light. 2 gates, both monitored, both heavy enough to stop a truck. Boone brought Lila through the north gate at 6:12 a.m., 3 hours before Wade Mercer's lawyer was scheduled to arrive at Ridgecrest General with a court order demanding the child's return. By the time that lawyer walked through the emergency room doors and found an empty exam table and a nurse who could not recall where the patient had gone, Lila was sitting in the mess hall of the Iron Wolves compound with a wool blanket around her shoulders and a plate of scrambled eggs she had not touched. She would not eat. She sat at the long wooden table with her hands in her lap and her eyes tracking every person who entered or exited the room, cataloging faces, measuring distances, reading the room the way a combat veteran reads terrain. Boone sat across from her, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest mechanic," and he did not push. He did not ask her to eat. He did not tell her she was safe. He just sat there and let the silence do what silence does when it is not filled with lies. It gave the girl room to breathe without having to perform gratitude for breathing. The mess hall door banged open and a gust of cold air rolled through. Cutter walked in. His real name was Marcus Webb, but nobody in the Iron Wolves had used that name in 11 years, not since the night he earned his road name in a bar fight in Reno, where he had ended an argument with a broken pool cue and a calm that terrified everyone who witnessed it, including the 3 men on the receiving end. He was the club's vice president, second in command, and the only man in the compound whose silence could match Boone's in weight and duration. He was 46, black, built like a shipping container, with a beard that had gone silver at the chin and hands that looked like they had been carved from walnut. 2 tours in Afghanistan, a dishonorable discharge he never discussed, a 12-year-old daughter he had not seen in 9 years because a family court in Nevada had decided that a man with his record was not fit to be a father. He looked at Lila. He looked at Boone. He pulled a chair from the next table, flipped it around, and sat with his arms folded across the backrest. "We need to talk," he said. "Not here." "Yes, here." Cutter's voice was low, steady, and carried the specific tension of a man who had been holding something behind his teeth for 3 hours. "Because what you did tonight, you made a call for the whole club without putting it to a vote." Boone set his coffee down. The ceramic made a small, sharp sound against the table. "She's 8 years old, Cut." "I can see that. I can also see that you rolled 30 brothers out of bed in a blizzard, deployed them to a public hospital, and extracted a minor from protective custody without a court order, without legal counsel, and without asking a single person in this club whether they were willing to catch a kidnapping charge." The word hung in the air between them. Kidnapping. It was the word nobody had said yet. The word everyone in the compound was thinking but had not spoken aloud because speaking it made it real, gave it weight, turned it from an act of protection into a felony that could bring the full machinery of Ridgecrest County law enforcement down on their heads. Lila's eyes moved between the two men. She had stopped tracking the exits. She was watching the argument instead, studying it with the focus of a child who had learned to read the precise moment when tension between adults became physical. Her body had gone rigid. Her fingers were clenched under the table. Boone noticed. He always noticed. "Lila," he said, his voice shifting, not softer, but lower, like an engine dropping into a different gear. "This is Cutter. He's loud, but he's not dangerous. Not to you. You understand?" Lila looked at Cutter. Cutter looked back at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of memory, of the daughter he had not held since she was 3. And then it was gone, buried under the discipline of a man who had spent a decade learning to keep the broken parts of himself locked in a room nobody else could enter. "Hey, kid," he said. His voice was gentler than Boone had heard it in years. "You like eggs?" Lila did not answer, but after a moment she picked up her fork. Cutter watched her take a small, cautious bite. Then he stood, jerked his head toward the door, and walked out without looking back. Boone followed. They stood on the porch of the mess hall in the gray winter light. The snow had stopped, but the sky was still thick with clouds, the color of old concrete. Across the compound, 3 brothers were clearing the driveway with shovels, their breath rising in white plumes. A dog, a one-eared pit bull mix named Diesel, who belonged to nobody and everybody, was nosing through a snowdrift near the workshop. The air smelled like wood smoke and frozen pine. Cutter lit a cigarette, took a long drag, let the smoke out slow. "You know who Wade Mercer is," he said, not a question. "I know what he did to that girl." "That's not what I asked." Cutter turned to face him. Wade Mercer's brother-in-law is Dale Harkin. Dale Harkin sits on the county board of supervisors. His wife's cousin is married to Tom Beckett, who manages the portfolio for half the commercial real estate in Ridgecrest. And Judge Halloran, the one who handles family court, plays poker with Mercer every Thursday night at the Elks Lodge. This is not a man. This is a network. And you just reached into the middle of it and pulled out the one thing they don't want anyone to see. Boone said nothing. He stared out at the tree line where the pines stood like a wall of black and green against the white sky. "I'm not saying the girl doesn't need help," Cutter continued. "I'm saying you didn't think. You reacted. You got a phone call in the middle of the night and you went full operator, and now 32 members of this club are exposed to federal charges because you couldn't pick up a phone and call a lawyer first." "What lawyer? At 2 a.m? In this county?" "Any lawyer. A bad lawyer. A lawyer who at least puts a piece of paper between us and a prison sentence." Cutter's jaw tightened. "You're the founder of this club, Boone. That means every decision you make falls on every man and woman wearing this patch. Every single one. And you made a war decision without a war vote." Boone turned to face him. The scar along his jaw caught the thin light. "You saw her, Cut." "Yeah, I saw her." "And?" Cutter was quiet for a long time. He smoked his cigarette down to the filter and crushed it under his boot. "And nothing," he said finally. "I would have done the same thing. That doesn't make it smart." He walked back inside. The door slammed behind him. Boone stood alone on the porch and listened to the silence of the compound and felt the weight of 32 lives pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing, like body armor he could not take off. Inside the mess hall, Lila had eaten half the eggs. It was a small thing, but Boone had been around enough broken people to know that small things were the only things that mattered. By noon, the compound was humming with a low electric tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Word had spread through the Brotherhood the way word always spread, not through announcements or meetings, but through the invisible current that ran between people who had lived in close quarters long enough to read each other's silences. 32 members, 11 old ladies, 4 prospects. All of them knew a child was in the mess hall. All of them knew why. And all of them had an opinion they were keeping behind their teeth, waiting for the right moment to let it loose. The first crack came at 1:15 p.m. Roach, real name Dennis Garza, 41, former Army medic, the club's sergeant-at-arms and the man responsible for security at the compound, walked into the workshop where Boone was rebuilding the carburetor on a 93 Softail and dropped a phone on the workbench. "We got a problem," Roach said. He was short, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been used as a punching bag and had won. His left hand was missing the last two fingers, a souvenir from an IED outside Fallujah that he never discussed and that nobody asked about. Mercer's lawyer filed an emergency motion with Judge Halloran, hearing set for Friday, 3 days. Boone wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the phone. The screen showed a forwarded email from a legal aid contact in the next county, one of the few lawyers who would take calls from the Iron Wolves without charging a retainer up front. What's the motion say? Parental kidnapping, custodial interference, endangerment of a minor. Roach paused. Your name's on it, Boone, specifically. My name. And the clubs. They're naming the Iron Wolves as a criminal organization that abducted a child for purposes of, get this, recruitment and exploitation. The silence in the workshop was absolute. Even the space heater in the corner seemed to hold its breath. Exploitation, Boone said. The word came out flat, dead, like a bullet casing hitting the floor. That's the play. They're going to paint us as predators, child traffickers, whatever sticks. Roach leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. I've seen this before. Not here, but in New Mexico, when the Devil's Thunder MC tried to intervene in a custody case in Las Cruces. State came down on them like a hammer, RICO charges, conspiracy. 3 brothers did federal time. The club folded inside a year. We're not Devil's Thunder. No, we're worse. We're an unregistered organization with no legal standing, no nonprofit status, and no documented chain of custody for a minor child who is currently the subject of an active court proceeding. In the eyes of the law, we are exactly what Mercer's lawyer says we are. Boone stared at the carburetor on the bench, grease on his fingers, the smell of gasoline and old metal, the cold pressing in through the gaps in the workshop walls. Get me Tally, he said. Roach hesitated. Something moved behind his eyes. Tally hasn't been to the compound in 8 months. I know. She left for a reason, Boone. I know that too. Get her anyway. Tally's full name was Natalie Voss. She was 39, blonde hair going gray at the roots, with a law degree from a state school that nobody in Ridgecrest's legal community respected and a record of representing clients that nobody in Ridgecrest's legal community would touch. She had been the Iron Wolves' unofficial legal counsel for 6 years, handling everything from traffic violations to assault charges to the one time a prospect named Wheelie had accidentally driven his bike through the plate glass window of a Dairy Queen during a charity ride. She was smart, relentless, and she drank too much. And she had been in love with Boone for 4 of those 6 years, a fact that everyone in the club knew and nobody discussed, least of all Boone, who had responded to her feelings with the same impenetrable silence he applied to everything that threatened to reach the parts of him that still had nerve endings. 8 months ago, she had told him she was done. Not with the club, with him, with the waiting, with the silence that had become its own kind of cruelty, because silence from a man you loved was not the same as silence from a stranger. It was a door that stayed closed no matter how many times you knocked. She had walked out of the compound on a Tuesday night in May and had not come back. Now Boone needed her, and he knew what that meant. He knew the cost of picking up the phone and asking someone you had hurt to help you, not because you deserved it, but because a child's life depended on it. He made the call from the workshop, standing next to the Softail with grease still on his hands and the cold biting through his flannel shirt. She answered on the 4th ring. I told you not to call me. I know. Then why are you calling? I need you. A long silence. He could hear music in the background, but something low, acoustic, playing in whatever apartment she had rented after she left. He could hear the click of a lighter. She had started smoking again. She only smoked when she was stressed or when she was angry, and right now she was probably both. You need me, she repeated. Not you miss me. Not you were wrong. You need me. Tally. Because that's what I am, right? A tool. Something you pick up when the situation calls for it and put down when it doesn't. There's a girl. Another silence. Shorter this time. What kind of girl? 8 years old. Stepfather's been beating her. Maybe worse. I pulled her out of Ridgecrest General last night. CPS is useless. Mercer's lawyer has already filed an emergency motion and the hearing is Friday. They're calling it parental kidnapping. They're naming me and the club. He heard her breathing change. The anger was still there, yet he could feel it through the phone like heat through a wall. But something else was moving underneath it. The thing that had drawn her to the Iron Wolves in the first place. The thing that made her take cases no other lawyer would touch. The thing that made her dangerous in a courtroom, because juries could feel it coming off her like a frequency. The absolute bone-deep refusal to let the wrong thing win. Friday, she said. That's 3 days. Yeah. In front of Halloran. Yeah. Halloran, who plays poker with Mercer every Thursday. Yeah, she laughed. It was not a happy sound. You don't do anything easy, do you? No? I'll be there in 2 hours. And Boone, when this is over, you and I are going to have a conversation that you've been avoiding for 4 years, and you're going to sit there and listen to every word of it. That's my price. Fine. Fine. She hung up. Boone set the phone down on the workbench and stood there in the cold workshop and felt something shift inside his chest. A tectonic movement, slow and deep, the kind of shift that happens before the ground opens up. He had spent 15 years building a life defined by control. Control of the club. Control of his emotions. Control of the distance between himself and everyone who tried to get close enough to see the damage. And now, in the space of 12 hours, a child he had never met had cracked that control wide open, and the cracks were spreading, and he could feel all the things he had sealed away beginning to leak through. The fear, the rage, the memory of his own childhood that he kept locked in a room at the back of his mind where the lights never came on. He picked up a wrench, set it down, picked it up again, put it back on the rack. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. At 3 p.m., Tally arrived in a silver Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a back seat full of legal files. She parked next to a row of Harleys that made her car look like a toy and walked into the compound with her shoulders squared and her jaw set, and a look in her eyes that said, I am here for the girl, not for you, and if you confuse the two, I will make you regret it. She spent 20 minutes with Lila. She came out of the mess hall with red eyes and a voice that had gone tight and thin. I need everything, she told Boone. Hospital records, photos of the injuries, Evelyn Hart's written statement, any prior CPS reports, any school records showing absences, any documentation from any source that establishes a pattern. I need it by tonight. Roach is working on the hospital records. Evelyn's writing her statement now. And CPS? 2 prior reports, both closed, no action taken. Tally's face did something complicated. 2 prior reports, and nobody did anything. Welcome to Ridgecrest. She pressed her fingers against her temples and breathed. Okay, here's what we're up against. Halloran is compromised. Everyone knows it. Nobody can prove it. Mercer's attorney is Carl Braddock from Braddock and Associates, which is the most connected firm in the county. They're going to argue that Lila was removed from protective custody without authorization by a known criminal organization, and that returning her to her legal guardian is in the child's best interest. They'll have character witnesses. They'll have Mercer in a suit looking like Father of the Year. And they'll have a judge who was eating steak with the man 3 nights ago. So what do? We make it impossible for Halloran to rule without the whole county watching. Media, advocacy groups, public pressure. If we can get enough eyes on this hearing, Halloran won't be able to bury it without burying himself. She paused. But there's a problem. What problem? You. She looked at him with an expression that combined affection, frustration, and exhaustion in equal measure. You're a convicted felon, Boone. Assault, 2014. The charge was pled down from aggravated, but it's on your record. Mercer's team will use it. They'll put your mugshot on a screen and ask the judge why a convicted violent offender is housing a minor child. And if Halloran was looking for a reason to rule against us, you just handed it to him on a silver plate. The compound went quiet around them. Even the wind seemed to pause. The assault charge, Boone said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Yeah. You know what that was. I know what you told me it was. I know you beat a man half to death outside a bar in Shelton. What I don't know, what's not in any court record, is why. Boone looked away. Toward the tree line. Toward the pines that stood like sentinels in the fading afternoon light. His jaw was working, the muscles along his neck pulling tight, and Tally could see it. The war inside him. The thing fighting to stay buried. The thing he had locked in that room at the back of his mind where the lights never came on. He was hurting a kid, Boone said. The words came out like they cost him something, like each one was a piece of shrapnel being pulled from old tissue. Outside the bar, in the parking lot, a boy, maybe 10, 11. The man had him by the arm and was... He stopped, swallowed, started again. I didn't think. I just moved. Tally stared at him. That's not in the police report. No. Why not? Because the boy was gone by the time the cops showed up, and the man, he was a city councilman. His lawyer made sure the narrative was a random bar fight, unprovoked assault by a biker with a record. And you didn't fight it. With what? A public defender who told me to take the plea? Against a councilman? Boone's voice was flat, stripped of self-pity, stating facts the way you state the weather. I did 18 months. The boy, I don't know what happened to him. I never found out. Tally was quiet for a long time. The light was fading. Across the compound, someone had turned on the floodlights, and they cast long shadows across the snow. Friday's hearing, she said finally. We need to get the assault context into the record. If we can show that your conviction was the result of protecting a child, it changes the narrative entirely. But I need proof. A witness. The boy. Something. It was 12 years ago, Tally. I know. She pulled her coat tighter around her. I'll find it. That's what I do. She walked toward her car, then stopped, turned back. One more thing. The text Evelyn got, the one about Mercer being connected to Halloran. Who sent it? Boone shook his head. We don't know. Someone inside the system is feeding us information. Someone who knows the custody file was sealed before Lila even reached the hospital. That means someone in Halloran's office, or the clerk's office, or CPS itself. She paused. That's either an ally or a trap. And right now I can't tell which. She got in her car and drove away down the gravel road, her taillights shrinking to red points and then vanishing into the trees. Boone stood in the compound yard and listened to the engine fade. Behind him, in the mess hall, Lila was sitting at the long table with the wool blanket still around her shoulders, drawing something on a piece of paper that Roach's wife had given her. She was drawing a house. Not a real house. A house with no doors. Just walls and a roof and windows that were colored in solid black. A house you could see out of, but no one could get into. At 7 p.m., Boone called church. Not the formal kind, not the full-patch vote with the gavel and the closed doors. Just the officers. Boone, Cutter, Roach, and a fourth man named Harlan Briggs, the club's road captain, 61 years old, Vietnam veteran, the oldest member of the Iron Wolves, and the only man alive who had been present the night Boone founded the club in a rented garage in Shelton with nothing but 3 bikes, a case of cheap beer, and a handshake agreement that whatever they built would exist for one purpose only, to stand between the vulnerable and the violence that the system refused to see. They sat in the workshop around a table made from a sheet of plywood laid across 2 sawhorses. A single bulb hung overhead, casting hard shadows. Coffee in mismatched mugs, the space heater clicking in the corner. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, and the compound was wrapped in the kind of silence that only comes when the world is too cold for sound. Cutter spoke first. Braddock filed the motion at 11 this morning. Hearing set for Friday, 9 a.m., in front of Halloran. The charges are custodial interference, parental kidnapping, and endangerment. If Halloran rules against us, Lila goes back to Mercer, and the state opens a criminal investigation into this club. How many brothers are named? Harlan asked. His voice was like old wood, rough, creaking, but solid underneath. Just Boone. For now. But the motion references the Iron Wolves as an organization, which means any member could be pulled in. Harlan nodded slowly. He took a sip of coffee and set the mug down with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to do everything deliberately, because the alternative was doing it recklessly, and recklessness had cost him things he could never get back. I was there tonight, Harlan said. At the hospital, standing in that parking lot. Watched that girl through the window while the snow came down. And I'll tell you what I saw. I saw myself, 60 years ago. Different house, different man with the belt, same look in the eyes. He paused. So whatever we're doing, I'm doing it. But I need to know we're doing it smart. Tally's handling the legal side, Boone said. Tally! Cutter leaned back. The woman you haven't spoken to in 8 months. She's the best we've got. She's the best you burned. Cutter held up a hand before Boone could respond. I'm not judging. I'm saying she's got every reason to walk away from this, and the only thing keeping her here is that kid. So you better make sure you don't give her a reason to stop. Boone said nothing. The bulb overhead flickered once. Shadows jumped and settled. There's something else, Roach said. He had been sitting quietly in the corner, his 2-fingered hand wrapped around a mug he was not drinking from. I ran Mercer's background through every contact I've got. Military records, financial records, county assessor, the works. And something doesn't add up. What? Mercer's listed occupation is independent contractor. Construction, remodeling, that kind of thing. But he drives a $70,000 truck and lives in a 4-bedroom house on Crestview Lane. His bank records, the ones I could access, show deposits that don't match any contract work, regular deposits, monthly, from a shell company registered in Delaware called Bridgewater Holdings. The room went still. Bridgewater Holdings, Boone repeated. I traced it as far as I could. The company has no employees, no physical address, and no listed officers. But its registered agent is the same law firm representing Mercer. Braddock and Associates, Cutter said. Yeah. So Mercer's attorney is also managing a shell company that's paying Mercer off the books. Cutter rubbed his jaw. For what? That's the question, Roach said. And I think the answer is the reason Mercer has so many friends in this county. Whatever Bridgewater Holdings is, whatever money is moving through it, it's big enough to buy a judge and scare an entire town into silence. Boone looked at each of them. Cutter, Roach, Harlan. 3 men who had followed him into situations that should have killed them and had come out the other side carrying scars they would never show to anyone outside this room. This isn't just about Lila anymore, he said. No, Roach agreed. It's not. The space heater clicked off. The workshop went cold. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing against the walls with a low moan that sounded almost human. At 9:30 p.m., Boone walked to the mess hall to check on Lila. She was asleep on the bench seat, curled into the wool blanket, her drawing still clutched in one hand. The house with no doors. He stood over her and looked at the picture and felt something move inside him that he had no name for. Something that lived below language, below thought, in the place where instinct and grief shared a border. He reached down and gently pulled the blanket higher over her shoulder. She stirred but did not wake. Her fingers tightened on the drawing. Even in sleep, she held on to things. Even in sleep, she was guarding herself. He turned to leave and found Cutter standing in the doorway, watching him. What? Boone said. Cutter studied him for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. You're not just protecting her, Cutter said quietly. You're trying to save the kid you used to be. Boone's whole body went rigid. His hands clenched at his sides. The scar along his jaw turned white. Don't, he said. One word. A wall. Cutter held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside and let Boone pass. In the corridor between the mess hall and the main lodge, Boone stopped walking. He put his hand against the wall and stood there in the dark with his eyes closed and his breathing uneven and the memory pressing against the inside of his skull like water against a dam. The belt, the closet, the hours spent in the dark counting his own heartbeats, because counting was the only thing that kept the panic from swallowing him whole. 8 years old. The same age as Lila, the same eyes, the same silence, the same terrible knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. He breathed. He pushed it down. He walked on. At 11 p.m., his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, different from the one that had contacted Evelyn. He opened it. 4 words. Mercer knows where she is. Boone stared at the screen. His blood went cold. He walked to the window and looked out at the compound. The dark cabins, the parked bikes, the razor wire gleaming under the floodlights, the tree line pressing in like the walls of a cage. Somewhere out there, beyond the frozen pines, beyond the county line, Wade Mercer was looking at the same darkness. And now he knew exactly where to look. Boone picked up the compound phone and dialed Roach. Lock it down, he said. Everything, now. He hung up and stood at the window and watched the shadows between the trees and felt the compound, his family, his last stand, transform in his mind from a sanctuary into something else entirely. A target. And the war he had started by answering a phone call at 2 a.m. was no longer coming. It was here. Lockdown took 11 minutes. Roach moved through the compound like a man defusing a bomb. Quiet, precise, no wasted motion. Floodlights killed. Perimeter cameras switched to infrared. The north and south gates chained and padlocked with industrial-grade steel. 3 brothers took position at the tree line with binoculars and handheld radios, their breath coming in white bursts against the frozen dark. 2 more stationed at the workshop roof, which gave a clear sightline to the gravel road for a quarter-mile in each direction. Diesel the pit bull was brought inside, not because anyone was worried about the dog, but because a barking dog in the wrong moment could give away position. By 11:20 p.m., the Iron Wolves compound had become something it had never been in 15 years of existence. A fortress. Boone stood at the window of the main lodge and watched the darkness beyond the razor wire and felt the compound breathing around him. 32 men and women who had followed him here on trust, on loyalty, on the belief that what they built together meant something. And now he had turned their home into a bunker because of a 4-word text from a number he could not trace. Mercer knows where she is. The question was not whether the text was true. The question was who sent it. The same person who had warned Evelyn about the sealed custody file. Someone inside the system. Someone with access to information that should have been locked behind court orders and confidentiality walls. Someone who was either trying to help or trying to manipulate. And Boone could not tell the difference, and that uncertainty sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. Cutter found him at midnight. The vice president had not slept. Neither had anyone else. The compound was wired tight, every nerve exposed, the way a combat unit gets when it knows contact is coming but does not know from which direction. Roach pulled the cell tower data on the text, Cutter said. He was holding a piece of paper with numbers scrawled on it. Both messages, the one to Evelyn and the one to you, came from burner phones. Different phones, different towers. But here's the thing. The tower that pinged your message is located less than 2 miles from the Ridgecrest County Courthouse. Boone turned from the window. Courthouse. Someone in that building is talking to us. Someone who knows Mercer, knows Halloran, knows the custody file was sealed, and knows the girl is here. Cutter paused. That's a very specific set of information. That narrows the pool to maybe 5-6 people. Can Roach narrow it further? He's working on it, but there's a faster way. Cutter set the paper on the windowsill. We call the number back. And if it's a setup, then we find out now instead of finding out on Friday in front of a judge. Boone picked up the paper. He looked at the number. 10 digits that could be a lifeline or a noose. He dialed. The phone rang 6 times. 7, 8. He was about to hang up when the line connected. No voice. Just breathing. Shallow. Fast. The breathing of someone who was afraid. You've been sending messages, Boone said. I need to know who you are. Silence. The breathing continued. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a woman's voice, young, tight with fear. Not on the phone. Then where? Garner's Diner, Route 9, 1 hour. A pause. Come alone. If I see anyone else, I'm gone and you'll never hear from me again. The line went dead. Cutter had been listening. He shook his head before Boone even spoke. No, absolutely not. You walk into a diner alone at 1 a.m. while Mercer knows where we are? That's not brave, Boone. That's stupid. She's scared. Good. Scared people are unpredictable. Scared people get other people killed. Cutter's voice was harder now, the vice president's voice, the voice of the man whose job was to protect the club when its founder was too deep inside his own mission to see the edges. Send me, or send Roach. Someone who isn't named in a kidnapping motion. She said alone. She also said she'd disappear if she saw anyone else. So I'll sit in the parking lot. She'll never see me. Boone considered this. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 tours and 15 years of running a motorcycle club in a county that wanted him gone, agreed with Cutter. The other part, the part that had knelt beside an 8-year-old's hospital bed and recognized something in her eyes that he had spent 30 years trying to forget, that part was already reaching for his jacket. "Parking lot," he said. "Stay in the truck. Engine off. And if it goes sideways, then you do what you do." Cutter stared at him. Then he nodded once and went to get his coat. Garner's Diner sat on Route 9 halfway between the compound and the Ridgecrest town line, a flat-roofed cinder-block building with a neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours, except the H had burned out years ago and nobody had fixed it." At 1 a.m. on a Wednesday in January, the parking lot held 2 cars. A rusted pickup that belonged to the overnight cook and a dark blue sedan parked at the far end, its engine running, exhaust curling into the frozen air like a question mark. Boone pulled his bike up to the front and killed the engine. The silence after a Harley dies is always louder than the noise that preceded it, a vacuum that rushes in to fill the space, sharp and absolute. He sat on the bike for a moment and scanned the lot. The sedan, the pickup, no other vehicles, no movement in the tree line across the road. The diner windows glowed yellow, and through them he could see 3 booths, all empty except one. A woman sat in the farthest booth with her back to the wall. She was wearing a dark coat buttoned to her chin, and her hands were wrapped around a coffee cup she was not drinking from. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose on one side. She was maybe 30, maybe younger. Stress and fear had a way of adding years to a face, and this woman's face carried both in heavy measure. Boone walked in. The bell above the door rang, a small, tired sound. The cook behind the counter, a heavy man with a beard and a stained apron, glanced up, registered leather and scars, and went back to his griddle with the deliberate disinterest of a man who had learned not to see things. Boone slid into the booth across from the woman. She flinched when he sat down, a full-body microjolt that she tried to control and could not. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her fingers on the coffee cup were trembling. "You sent the messages," Boone said. She nodded, swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "My name is Claire Dunmore. I'm a clerk in Judge Halloran's office." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "I process filings, case documents, custody orders, sealed records." "How do you know about Mercer?" Claire looked at the table. Her jaw was working, the muscles along her throat pulling tight. She picked up the coffee cup, set it back down without drinking, and wrapped her fingers around it again as if it were the only solid thing in the world. "Because Lila isn't the first one," she said. The diner hummed around them. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The cook scraped his griddle. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, and the neon sign flickered its broken word. Boone did not move. He did not blink. He sat perfectly still and let those 6 words settle into the space between them like a stone dropped into deep water, and he waited for the ripples. 3 years ago," Claire said, her voice barely audible now, "a girl named Mackenzie Pruitt was removed from a foster home in Ridgecrest after her foster father was accused of physical abuse. The case went before Halloran. Mercer's name never appeared in the file, but Braddock and Associates represented the foster father. The case was sealed. Mackenzie was returned to the home. 6 months later, she was hospitalized with a fractured skull. The foster father claimed she fell downstairs. No charges were filed." She paused. Her hands were shaking so hard the coffee cup rattled against the saucer. 18 months ago, a boy named Tyler Hess was flagged by his school for repeated unexplained injuries. CPS opened an investigation. The caseworker assigned was a woman named Janet Polk. Janet filed a report recommending immediate removal. 2 days later, Janet was reassigned to a different county. The report disappeared. Tyler stayed in the home. His stepfather's name was not Wade Mercer, but his stepfather's attorney was Carl Braddock. Boone's jaw clenched so hard his back teeth ground together. "How many? How many kids? How many cases?" Claire looked at him. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by something else, something hollow and sick and old, the look of a person who had been carrying a weight they were never designed to hold. 7, she said. 7 cases in 4 years, all involving children, all sealed by Halloran, all represented by Braddock, all connected by a pattern of abuse that was reported, investigated, and then buried. She reached into her coat and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers, and slid it across the table. Case numbers, filing dates, the names of every CPS caseworker who was reassigned or terminated after flagging these cases. Financial records showing payments from Bridgewater Holdings to Braddock and Associates. Boone looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. Bridgewater Holdings, he said. Roach found that name tonight. A shell company paying Mercer. It's not just paying Mercer, it's paying Braddock. It's paying a county supervisor named Dale Harkin. And it's funding Halloran's re-election campaign through a PAC that doesn't legally exist. Claire's voice had dropped to a whisper. This isn't one man beating one child, Mr. Ryder. This is a system, a pipeline. Braddock recruits the families. Halloran seals the records. CPS looks the other way because anyone who doesn't gets fired. And Bridgewater Holdings moves money through it all like blood through a vein. The diner seemed to contract around them. The lights felt hotter. The walls felt closer. Boone's hands were flat on the table, completely still. But inside his chest, something was happening that felt like a controlled demolition. The systematic collapse of every assumption he had carried into this fight. He had thought he was protecting one girl from one man. He was wrong. He was standing at the edge of something much larger, much deeper, much more dangerous than a custody dispute in a small county court. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back with the vicious discipline of someone who had decided a long time ago that crying was a luxury she could not afford. "Because I processed Tyler Hess's file," she said. "I saw the photos, the injuries. I saw what happened to him after the case was sealed and nobody did anything. I filed the paperwork that made it disappear." Her voice broke. She pressed her hand over her mouth, held it there for 3 seconds, and then dropped it. "I didn't know. Not at first. I thought it was just bureaucratic negligence, overworked caseworkers, budget cuts, the usual. And then I started to see the pattern, the same law firm, the same judge, the same shell company, and I realized I wasn't just filing paperwork, I was helping them." She said the last 2 words like they were made of broken glass. "I tried to go to the state attorney general's office 6 months ago," she continued. "I called their tip line. I gave them everything I had. 2 weeks later, a man came to my apartment. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't threaten me. He just stood in my doorway and said, 'We're aware of your concerns and we appreciate your civic mindfulness, and we want you to know that the matter is being handled internally.' And then he left. And nothing happened. Nothing. 6 months and nothing." Boone picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. "If Mercer's network finds out you gave me this, I know. They'll destroy you, professionally, possibly worse." "I know." She looked at him with those hollow, haunted eyes. "I've spent 6 months waiting for someone to do something. Anyone. Any institution, any authority, any system that's supposed to work. None of them did. And then I heard about you. I heard about what happened at the hospital. An ER nurse called a motorcycle club in the middle of a blizzard because every other door was closed." She paused. "You're the last door, Mr. Ryder. And if you don't open, there are no more doors." Boone sat with the envelope in his hands and felt the weight of 7 children pressing down on him. 7 names, 7 sealed files. 7 kids who had been swallowed by a system designed to protect them and had come out the other side broken, damaged, disappeared into paperwork and silence, while the adults who were supposed to care looked the other way because looking the other way was easier, was safer, was the thing you did when the people hurting children had more power than the people trying to stop them. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "What?" "Go somewhere safe, tonight, not your apartment, not anywhere Mercer's people would look." "I don't have anywhere." "I'll send someone. A woman named Roach's wife, Marta. She'll take you to the compound. You'll stay there until the hearing." Claire stared at him. "The compound? Your compound? It's the only place in this county that Halloran can't touch." She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded once, a small, exhausted movement, and picked up her coffee for the first time and drank. Boone left the diner at 1:45 a.m. Cutter was in the parking lot in a black pickup with the engine off and his hands on the steering wheel. Boone got in the passenger side and set the envelope on the dash. "We have a problem," he said. "Just one?" "It's not just Mercer. It's Braddock. It's Halloran. It's a shell company called Bridgewater Holdings that's been moving money through this county for at least 4 years, funding a network that seals child abuse cases and buries the evidence. 7 kids, cut. 7 that she knows of. Could be more. Cutter did not speak for a long time. He sat in the dark cab of the pickup with his hands still on the wheel and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Boone could see the calculations happening behind them. The strategic mind, the operational mind, the mind that had run logistics for an infantry battalion in Helmand Province and had learned to process impossible information without allowing it to paralyze him. 7 kids, Cutter said finally. 7 cases sealed by Halloran, all connected to Braddock, all funded through Bridgewater. And Mercer is what? A participant? A client? I don't know yet. Could be both. Could be something worse. Cutter exhaled slowly through his nose. If we bring this to the hearing on Friday, if Tally puts this in front of Halloran, we're not just challenging a custody order, we're accusing a sitting judge of corruption, a county supervisor of conspiracy, and the most powerful law firm in Ridgecrest of running a criminal enterprise, in their own courtroom. I know. They'll bury us, legally, professionally, personally, every brother in the club, every old lady, every prospect. They'll come after our businesses, our licenses, our property. They'll find every unpaid parking ticket, every code violation, every misdemeanor from the last 20 years and stack them until we can't breathe. I know. And you want to do it anyway. Boone looked at him. In the thin light from the diner sign, the scar along his jaw was a white line drawn across skin the color of old leather. His eyes were steady. His hands were not shaking anymore. I didn't start this club to ride motorcycles, he said. Cutter studied him for a long moment. Then he started the engine. They drove back to the compound in silence, the headlights cutting through the dark pines, the manila envelope sitting on the dash between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. At 2:30 a.m., Boone spread Claire's documents across the plywood table in the workshop. Cutter, Roach, and Harlan stood around it, their faces lit by the single overhead bulb, their expressions shifting as they read. Nobody spoke for 15 minutes. The only sound was the turning of pages and the occasional sharp intake of breath when someone reached a passage that was worse than the one before it. Harlan finished first. He set the papers down carefully, aligned their edges, and placed his scarred hands flat on the table. Mackenzie Pruitt, he said. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. 12 years old, fractured skull, returned to her abuser by court order, hospitalized again 8 months later. Then she disappeared from the system entirely. No school records after 2023, no medical records, no forwarding address. He looked up. Where is she now? We don't know, Boone said. Harlan's hands curled into fists on the table, slowly, the knuckles going white. He was 61 years old, and he had carried the weight of 2 wars and a lifetime of things he could not unsee. And in that moment, he looked like a man who had just discovered that the thing he had spent his whole life fighting had been happening in his own backyard while he was not looking. This changes everything, Roach said. He was pacing now, 2 fingers missing from his left hand curled against his palm, his right hand pulling at his beard. If we bring this to the hearing, we're not arguing for one kid. We're blowing open a corruption network. We need federal attention, FBI, U.S. Attorney, something with jurisdiction above the county level. We don't have time, Cutter said. Hearing's in 2 days. Then we stall the hearing. How? Halloran controls the calendar. Braddock controls the motions. We file for a continuance, Halloran denies it, and moves forward. We request a change of venue, Halloran denies it, and moves forward. Every procedural tool available to us runs through a judge who is part of the thing we're trying to expose. Tally, Boone said. Tally can get this to the state bar. File an emergency complaint against Halloran. If there's an active ethics investigation, Halloran has to recuse. In 2 days? The state bar moves slower than ice. Then we make them move faster. Roach stopped pacing. He looked at Boone with an expression that combined admiration and exhaustion in equal measure. You're talking about going to war with the entire county power structure, with a motorcycle club, on behalf of a child who the system has already decided doesn't matter. Yeah, Boone said. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The workshop fell silent. The space heater ticked. Somewhere outside, a coyote called from the ridge above the compound, a long, thin sound that traveled through the cold air like a wire pulled tight. "There's something else," Roach said. His voice had changed. Lower, careful. The voice of a man who was about to deliver information he did not want to deliver. "I pulled Mercer's military records tonight. Or I tried to. Most of them are sealed, redacted beyond anything I've ever seen for a standard discharge. But there's a gap. A 17-month gap between his listed service dates and his discharge paperwork." "What kind of gap?" "The kind that doesn't exist unless someone made it disappear. No deployment records, no unit assignments, no fitness reports. Just a blank space from March 2011 to August 2012, and then a discharge under conditions that are classified beyond my clearance to access." The room temperature seemed to drop. Not physically, but something in the air changed, some invisible pressure that made the walls feel thinner and the darkness outside feel closer. "Classified military records," Cutter said slowly. "Connected to a shell company moving money through a county corruption network. Connected to a judge who seals child abuse cases," Harlan added. "Connected to a law firm that represents every abuser in the county," Roach finished. They stood there in the workshop at 3 a.m, 4 men in leather and flannel and scars, and looked at the documents spread across the plywood table, and each of them understood, without saying it, without needing to say it, that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had lifted a stone expecting to find one snake, and had found a nest. And the nest was deeper and darker and more tangled than anything they had prepared for. Boone collected the papers, squared them, placed them back in the manila envelope. "Nobody sleeps," he said. "Tally gets these at first light. We move the hearing strategy from custody defense to full exposure, and we start making copies of everything, multiple copies, stored in multiple locations. If something happens to us, if something happens to this compound, these documents survive." "And Lila?" Harlan asked. Boone looked toward the mess hall. Through the workshop window, across the frozen yard, he could see the faint light leaking from the mess hall doorway where he had left her sleeping. "Lila stays here, no matter what. Even if Halloran sends marshals? Even then." Cutter crossed his arms. "That's contempt of court, Boone. That's a jail cell." "I've been in a jail cell. I survived it. Lila won't survive going back to Mercer." He looked at each of them in turn. "This is the line. Right here. This is where we decide what this club is. Not what it says on the patch. Not what we tell ourselves at night. What it actually is, when the cost is real, and the risk is real, and the system that's supposed to do the right thing has been broken from the inside." Harlan spoke first. "I'm in." 2 words, no hesitation. The voice of a man who had been waiting 60 years to draw a line exactly like this one. Roach nodded. "In." Cutter was last. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and his eyes on Boone, and in those eyes was everything. The disagreement from the first morning, the frustration, the fear for the club, the memory of his own daughter he had not held in 9 years, the knowledge that what they were about to do would either save them or destroy them, and there was no middle ground. "In," he said, "but when this is over, we're restructuring how decisions get made. No more unilateral calls." "Fair," Boone said. "I mean it. I know you do." At 5 a.m., the sky began to lighten, not with color, but with a thin gray luminescence that seeped through the clouds like watered-down milk. Boone walked across the compound to the mess hall. His boots crunched on frozen gravel. His breath came in white clouds. His body felt like it was made of rust and wire, held together by caffeine and something older than caffeine, something that lived in the marrow. He opened the mess hall door and stopped. Lila was awake. She was sitting at the long table with her drawing in front of her, the house with no doors. And she was adding something new to it. Boone stepped closer and looked over her shoulder. She had drawn people inside the house. Small figures, barely more than stick shapes, arranged in a circle around something in the center of the room. Each figure wore what looked like a rectangle across its shoulders. A cut, Boone realized. She had drawn leather cuts on the figures. And in the center of the circle, smaller than the rest, she had drawn a single figure sitting alone. A child. surrounded by protectors she had known for less than 48 hours. Boone felt something crack inside him, not break, crack. The way ice cracks on a river in early spring, the fracture line spreading outward from a single point, letting light through from underneath. "That's us?" he asked. His voice was rough. Lila nodded. She did not look up from the drawing. "Why doesn't the house have doors?" She was quiet for a long time. Her crayon, red, worn down to a nub, hovered over the paper. "Because doors let people in," she said. Boone sat down next to her, not across from her, next to her, close enough that she could feel his presence without being crowded by it. He sat there in silence and watched her draw, and he thought about 7 children whose names he had read in a manila envelope at 3 in the morning, and he thought about the hearing in 2 days, and he thought about Cutter saying, "You're trying to save the kid you used to be," and he thought about the closet and the belt and the dark and the counting, and he thought about the fact that in 48 hours he had gone from a man who kept the world at arm's length to a man who was about to burn down everything he had built to protect a child who drew houses without doors. At 6:15 a.m., his phone rang. Tally. "I've been up all night," she said. No greeting, no preamble. "I found your witness. The boy from the bar fight in Shelton. His name is Derek Cahill. He's 22 now, lives in Portland. He's willing to give a statement." Something loosened in Boone's chest, a knot he had carried for 12 years. "And there's something else," Tally continued. Her voice had changed, slower, heavier. The voice of someone delivering news they wished they did not have. "I was going through court records looking for anything connected to Braddock and Associates, and I found a filing from 2019. A wrongful death suit, settled out of court, sealed by Halloran." "Whose death?" "A girl named Mackenzie Pruitt. She died in foster care in November 2023. She was 14 years old. The cause of death on the certificate says cardiac arrest, but the sealed medical examiner's report, which should not have been in the court file but someone made an error and included it, lists multiple organ failure consistent with prolonged physical trauma." The mess hall was silent. Lila was still drawing. The red crayon moved across the paper in small, precise strokes. She was adding something to the roof of the doorless house, something Boone could not see from where he was sitting. "She died," Boone said. The words came out flat, bloodless. "In a home that Halloran sent her back to, after Braddock argued for reunification, after CPS closed the case." Boone closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the faces of children he had never met, children whose names were typed on court documents and sealed behind judicial orders and buried under the weight of a system that had been designed to protect them and had instead become the mechanism of their destruction. "Tally," he said, "bring everything you have to the compound, today. We're not just going to the hearing on Friday." "What are you going to do?" He opened his eyes, looked at Lila. She had finished the drawing. She held it up for him to see. The house with no doors now had something on its roof. Not a chimney, not an antenna, a flag. A small, crude, triangular flag drawn in red crayon. A signal. The kind you plant on a hill you intend to defend. "We're going to blow it open," Boone said. "All of it. Every name, every file, every dollar. And if Halloran tries to shut us down, we make sure the whole world is watching when he does." He hung up the phone and sat beside a girl who was holding a drawing of a house she had invented. A house without doors because doors let people in. A house filled with crude figures wearing leather cuts. A house with a red flag on its roof that meant something only she understood. And he realized that the decision had already been made. Not in the workshop at 3 in the morning, not in the diner with Claire Dunmore, not even at the hospital 2 nights ago when he had answered Evelyn's call. The decision had been made 30 years ago. In a closet, in the dark, by an 8-year-old boy counting his own heartbeats, because counting was the only thing that kept the panic from swallowing him whole. That boy had made a promise to himself. A promise he could not have articulated then because he did not have the words. But the promise was simple, and it was absolute, and it had lived inside him like a pilot light for 3 decades, waiting for enough fuel to become a fire. No more. No more sealed files. No more disappeared children. No more systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the small. No more silence. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the tops of the pines and turned them gold. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a diesel engine started. Heavy, guttural, the sound of something large moving through the winter dark. Boone walked to the window and looked out. On the county road, just visible through the trees, a black SUV with tinted windows was parked on the shoulder. Its engine was running. Its headlights were off. Watching. Boone watched it back. And somewhere in the mess hall behind him, Lila Cross set down her red crayon and folded her drawing carefully in half and placed it inside the pocket of the oversized hoodie she had been wearing since the night she walked into an emergency room alone during the worst blizzard in 40 years. And she kept it there, against her chest, where she could feel its edges pressing against her skin like a promise someone had finally made and finally intended to keep. The SUV sat on the road for 17 minutes. Then it pulled away and disappeared into the trees. But they both knew it would be back. They all knew. And in 2 days, inside a courtroom controlled by the very people they were about to expose, the Iron Wolves would have to make a choice that no amount of leather and engine noise could protect them from. Win publicly, and destroy a network that had been devouring children for years. Or lose, and watch Lila Cross walk back into the hands of the man who had promised to finish what he started. There would be no middle ground, no negotiation, no second chance. And the people on the other side of that courtroom had spent 4 years building a machine specifically designed to ensure that people like Boone Ryder, people with records, people with scars, people the system had already labeled as unfit, never won. Not once. Not ever. Friday arrived the way a bullet arrives, fast, inevitable, and with the full intention of ending something. Boone had not slept in 41 hours. His body was running on black coffee and a kind of fury that had settled into his bones like a low-grade fever, constant and quiet and impossible to shake. He stood in the bathroom of the main lodge at 5 a.m. and looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man he barely recognized. Hollowed cheeks, bloodshot eyes, the scar along his jaw standing out white against skin that had gone the color of old cement. He splashed cold water on his face. It did not help. He put on a clean flannel shirt, the only one he owned without grease stains or cigarette burns, and buttoned it to the collar. He pulled on his leather cut over it. Then he took the cut off, held it in his hands, and stared at the wolf's head patch. Tally had told him not to wear it to court. She said the leather would be a weapon in Braddock's hands, a visual shorthand that would let the opposing counsel paint every man in the gallery as a threat without saying a word. She was right. He knew she was right. He put the cut back on. Some things you do not take off. Some things you wear because removing them would be a lie. And he had decided 3 days ago that whatever happened in that courtroom, he was going to walk in as exactly what he was. Not reformed, not apologetic, not performing respectability for a judge who had spent 4 years burying children in paperwork. He was going to walk in as Boone Ryder, founder of the Iron Wolves, convicted felon, 3-tour Marine, and the man who had taken an 8-year-old girl out of a hospital in the middle of a blizzard because every system designed to protect her had already failed. Let them see the leather. Let them see the scars. Let them see what shows up when everything else looks away. At 5:30 a.m., and the compound began to move. Bikes pulled out of the workshop one at a time, engines turning over in the frozen dark with that deep guttural cough that Harleys make when the air is cold enough to resist combustion. 31 riders. Cutter at the front, Roach at the rear, Harlan somewhere in the middle on a 97 Road King that he had rebuilt 3 times and refused to replace because he said a man should ride something that had survived as much as he had. They formed a column on the gravel road and waited, their headlights cutting parallel lines through the pre-dawn mist, their exhaust rising in white plumes that merged with the fog and disappeared. Boone came out of the lodge with Lila. She was wearing the cleanest clothes Marta, Roach's wife, had been able to find. A pair of jeans rolled at the cuffs, a dark sweater, a winter coat that was still too big but less dramatically so than the hoodie she had arrived in. Her hair had been brushed and pulled back. She looked small and scrubbed and impossibly young, and she was holding the folded drawing against her chest inside the coat pocket, her fingers pressed against the paper the way a soldier presses a hand against a wound to keep what is inside from getting out. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at the column of motorcycles idling in the dark. 31 bikes, 31 riders in leather, 31 scarred, damaged, imperfect human beings who had gotten out of bed before dawn to ride 30 miles in January cold for a child most of them had known for less than a week. "They're all coming?" she asked. Her voice was small. "Every one of them," Boone said. She looked up at him. Something moved in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the shadow of it, the outline of what trust might look like if she ever found the courage to let it in. "Why?" Boone crouched beside her. His knees ached, his back ached, everything ached. He looked at her face in the pale light and saw the bruise on her jaw that had faded to yellow-green, and the way she held her left arm slightly away from her body because the ribs still hurt, and the way her eyes kept moving, always scanning, always calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit. "Because that's what we do," he said. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. But it was true, and true was the only thing he had left to give. They rode in convoy. Boone drove a truck with Lila in the passenger seat because Tally had said absolutely not to putting the child on a motorcycle on the way to a custody hearing, and Tally was right about that too. The Iron Wolves flanked the truck in formation, bikes on both sides, bikes in front, bikes behind, a rolling wall of chrome and leather and engine noise that filled the county road from shoulder to shoulder. Cars pulled over to let them pass. A school bus driver stared through her windshield with her mouth open. A state trooper parked at a gas station watched the column go by and reached for his radio and then set it back down because whatever this was, it was bigger than a traffic stop. They reached the Ridgecrest County Courthouse at 8:17 a.m. The building sat on Main Street between a hardware store and a vacant lot, a two-story brick structure with white columns out front that were supposed to suggest authority and instead suggested a building that was trying too hard to be something it was not. News vans were already parked along the curb, 2 local affiliates and 1 from the state capitol. Tally's media strategy had worked. She had spent the last 36 hours calling every journalist, advocacy group, and legal watchdog she could reach, feeding them just enough information to create the scent of a story without revealing the full scope of what Claire Dunmore's documents contained. The bait had worked. The cameras were here. The Iron Wolves parked their bikes in a row along the street, the chrome catching the flat winter light. They dismounted in unison, a choreography born not from practice, but from years of doing the same thing in the same order. Kickstand down, helmet off, gloves tucked into belt, leather straightened. They stood on the sidewalk in a loose formation and waited, not speaking, not performing, just present. The courthouse lobby smelled like floor wax and old wood and the kind of institutional coffee that tastes like it was brewed sometime last century and never stopped. Security consisted of 1 metal detector and 1 guard, a heavy man in his 60s named Fletcher, who looked at the line of leather-clad bikers filing through his checkpoint and wisely decided not to make conversation. Courtroom 2B was on the 2nd floor. It was small, maybe 60 seats in the gallery, a judge's bench elevated on a platform that added 3 feet of artificial authority, 2 counsel tables, a witness stand. The fluorescent lights overhead gave everything a sickly greenish tint that made healthy people look ill and ill people look dead. Braddock was already seated at the plaintiff's table. Carl Braddock, 62, silver hair, charcoal suit that cost more than Boone's truck, reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had never been broken. He looked like a man who had spent his entire career ensuring that his hands stayed clean while the things he arranged got very, very dirty. Beside him sat Wade Mercer. Boone saw Mercer and felt his blood change temperature. Mercer had cleaned up, fresh haircut, clean shave, a navy blazer over a white shirt. He looked like a PTA dad. He looked like a man who coached Little League and mowed his lawn on Saturdays and waved at neighbors from his porch. He looked like exactly the kind of man that a system built on appearances was designed to protect. But his eyes had not changed. Small, deep-set, calculating. The eyes of a man who had beaten an 8-year-old girl across her ribs and her back and her collarbone, and had done it with the confidence of someone who knew that the consequences would never reach him. Boone sat at the defense table beside Tally. Lila sat between them, her hands folded in her lap, her feet not reaching the floor. Behind them, the gallery filled with Iron Wolves, one by one, row by row. Leather cuts bearing the wolf's head patch, scarred hands resting on scarred knees, faces that had been shaped by war and loss and violence and survival and the particular kind of stubborn love that only exists in people who have been broken enough to understand what breaking means. 93 of them. Cutter had called in every member, every charter, every retired brother who could still ride. They filled the gallery to capacity and spilled into the hallway. The court clerk looked at the crowd, and then looked at the bailiff, and then looked at the fire code posted on the wall and made a decision that today was not the day to enforce occupancy limits. Judge Raymond Halloran entered at 9:02 a.m. He was 67, lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dry wood, angular, expressionless, designed to reveal nothing. He wore his robe with the ease of a man who had spent 20 years behind a bench and had long ago stopped thinking of it as a costume and started thinking of it as skin. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked out at the gallery. His face did not change when he saw the bikers, but something behind his eyes moved. A flicker, a calculation, the briefest contraction of the pupils that Boone recognized because he had spent his life reading faces in rooms where reading faces was the difference between living and dying. Halloran was surprised, not by the bikers, by how many of them there were, and by the cameras he had seen parked outside. He had expected to control this room. He was realizing he might not. "This court is now in session," Halloran said. His voice was measured, professional, the voice of a man who had learned to use neutrality as a weapon. Case number 2-026-FC-0914, in the matter of Mercer versus Ryder. Mr. Braddock, your opening statement. Braddock rose. He buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, a practiced gesture, smooth, the kind of thing trial lawyers rehearse in mirrors, and faced the bench. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. On the night of January 14th, my client's stepdaughter was removed from Ridgecrest General Hospital without parental consent, without a court order, and without the involvement of any authorized child welfare agency. She was taken by the defendant, Boone Ryder, a convicted felon with a documented history of violence, and transported to a remote compound operated by the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, an unregistered organization with no legal standing, no child care credentials, and no authority whatsoever to assume custody of a minor child. He paused. Let the words settle. We are asking the court to order the immediate return of Lila Cross to her legal guardian, Wade Mercer, and to refer this matter to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. He sat down. Clean, efficient, devastating. Tally stood. She was wearing a black blazer she had borrowed from Marta because her own court clothes were in an apartment she had not been back to in 3 days. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were red from 2 nights without sleep. She looked like someone who had been through a war and had decided to fight one more battle before she collapsed. Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that returning this child to Wade Mercer would constitute an imminent threat to her life. We further intend to present evidence of a pattern of systemic failure within Ridgecrest County's child welfare and judicial systems that has resulted in the suppression of at least 7 documented cases of child abuse over a 4-year period. The courtroom shifted. A murmur ran through the gallery, not from the bikers, who sat in absolute silence, but from the handful of journalists in the back row, whose pens started moving faster. Halloran's face did not change, but his hand, resting on the bench beside his gavel, tightened almost imperceptibly. Counselor, he said, this is a custody proceeding. The scope of your argument will be limited to the matter at hand. With respect, Your Honor, the matter at hand cannot be separated from the systemic context in which it exists. The safety of this child is directly connected to the functioning, or malfunctioning, of the institutions responsible for her protection. You're testing the boundaries of this court's patience, Ms. Voss. I'm testing the boundaries of this court's conscience, Your Honor. The room held its breath. Halloran stared at Tally. Tally held his gaze without flinching. Boone watched the judge's hands and saw the knuckles whiten on the edge of the bench. Proceed, Halloran said. The word came out like a door being closed, hard, final, carrying the unspoken promise that the door would not stay open long. Braddock called Wade Mercer to the stand. Mercer walked to the witness chair with the measured confidence of a man who had been coached, rehearsed, and assembled into a version of himself that bore no resemblance to the man who had walked into an emergency room 4 nights ago, smelling like whiskey and ownership. He sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at the judge with an expression of wounded fatherhood so perfectly calibrated that Boone's stomach turned. Braddock led him through the script. Yes, Lila had fallen in the garage. Yes, she was clumsy, always had been. Yes, he had been concerned when she disappeared from the hospital. Yes, he loved her. Yes, he only wanted what was best for her. Yes, he had been devastated by the accusations. His voice cracked at the right moments. His eyes glistened at the right moments. He was performing grief with the precision of a man who had performed it before, in front of other judges, in other courtrooms, and had always walked out the other side with the child still in his hands. Tally cross-examined. Mr. Mercer, you told this court that Lila fell in the garage. Can you describe the specific mechanism of injury that would produce bruising on both forearms, the upper back, and the collarbone simultaneously? She fell off her bike. Off a bicycle. In January. In a garage. We keep the bike in the garage. She rides it around. And the bicycle fell on her forearms, her back, and her collarbone. All at once. Mercer's jaw tightened. The mask slipped. Just for a second. Just a fraction. And beneath it Boone saw the real face. The face that existed behind closed doors. The face that Lila had learned to read the way animals read the sky before a storm. Kids get hurt, Mercer said. His voice had dropped half an octave. Controlled, dangerous. It happens. It does, Tally agreed. It happened to Mackenzie Pruitt. It happened to Tyler Hess. It happened to at least 5 other children in this county over the past 4 years, all represented by your attorney, all cases sealed by this court. Braddock was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Objection, relevance. These cases are sealed and opposing counsel has no standing to. I have standing when the seal itself is evidence of a cover-up, Your Honor. That is an outrageous accusation. It is a documented accusation. Tally turned to the bench. Your Honor, I am entering into evidence a set of documents obtained from a source within the county clerk's office. These documents include case numbers, filing dates, financial records, and communications that establish a direct connection between Braddock and Associates, a shell company called Bridgewater Holdings, and a pattern of judicial action in this court that has systematically suppressed child abuse investigations and returned endangered children to their abusers. She placed the manila envelope on the clerk's desk. The envelope Claire Dunmore had slid across a diner table at 1 a.m. The envelope that contained 7 children's names and the machinery that had eaten them. The courtroom erupted. Braddock was shouting objection. Mercer's face had gone white. Halloran was banging his gavel with the mechanical fury of a man who could feel control slipping through his fingers like water through a cracked dam. The journalists in the back were on their phones. The iron wolves in the gallery sat motionless, a wall of leather and silence that made the chaos around them seem louder by contrast. Order, Halloran barked. Order in this court. He turned to Tally with an expression that had abandoned neutrality entirely. Counselor, if you introduce sealed materials into open court, you are in contempt. Then hold me in contempt, Your Honor. But those documents are going into evidence, and the cameras outside are going to report on every word spoken in this room today. Whatever happens next happens in public. Halloran stared at her. The courtroom went silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the gallery, a leather jacket creaked as someone shifted weight. The judge exhaled through his nose. Slowly. The exhale of a man recalculating. The court will review the documents in chambers, he said. This hearing is in recess for 30 minutes. He stood and walked out. The door to his chambers closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Tally sat down at the defense table. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the surface and breathed. That was either the best or worst thing I've ever done in a courtroom, she said. Boone looked at her. Which one? I'll let you know in 30 minutes. Lila had not moved during the entire exchange. She sat in her chair with her hands folded and her feet dangling and her eyes fixed on the witness stand where Wade Mercer had sat and lied with the fluency of a man who had been lying his entire life. She had not flinched when Braddock shouted. She had not reacted when Halloran banged his gavel. She had watched the whole thing with the terrible patience of a child who understood that adults performed for each other in rooms like this, and that the performance rarely had anything to do with the truth. "Lila," Tally said softly, leaning close, "when the judge comes back, he may ask you to testify. You don't have to. Nobody is going to force you. But if you want to speak, if you want to tell the truth about what happened, we will be right here. Every one of us." Lila looked over her shoulder at the gallery. 93 faces looked back at her. Scarred, weathered, damaged, fierce. Men and women who had ridden 30 miles in the cold and sat in a courtroom for hours and had not spoken a word because they understood, all of them, in their bones, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present when someone needs to know they are not alone. Lila turned back to Tally. "I want to talk," she said. The recess lasted 47 minutes. When Halloran returned, his face had changed. The wooden neutrality was gone. In its place was something more complicated. The expression of a man who had looked at a set of documents in the privacy of his chambers and had realized that the machine he had been operating was now visible to the world, and that every decision he made in the next hour would determine whether he went down with it. "This court will hear testimony from the minor child," Halloran said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of performance, the voice of a man who had run out of masks. "Miss Cross, please take the stand." Lila walked to the witness chair. She climbed up. Her feet did not reach the floor. The chair was too big. The microphone was too high. The courtroom was too large. Everything in this room had been built for adults, by adults, and she existed in it like a single note played on an instrument designed for a different song. Braddock stood. "Your Honor, the child is 8 years old. Her testimony cannot be considered reliable without—" "Sit down, Mr. Braddock." Halloran's voice was flat. "Final." Braddock sat. Tally approached the stand. She moved slowly, carefully, the way Evelyn had moved in the emergency room 4 nights ago. "Lila, can you tell the court what happened the night you came to the hospital?" Lila looked at the microphone. She looked at the judge. She looked at Braddock and Mercer sitting at the plaintiff's table. Mercer was staring at her with an expression that from the outside might have looked like concern, but from Lila's position, from the position of someone who had spent years learning to decode that face the way a prisoner decodes a guard, was something else entirely. It was a warning. Do not speak. Do not tell. You know what happens when you tell. Lila's hand started shaking. Her lower lip trembled. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. The courtroom waited. The silence was enormous, oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the child from every direction. She looked at Mercer again. His eyes held hers. The warning was louder now, transmitted on a frequency that only she could hear, the frequency of 4 years of closed doors and raised hands, and the particular silence that fills a house after violence has happened and before the next round begins. She was crumbling. Boone could see it. Tally could see it. Everyone in the room could see it. The 8-year-old girl who had walked through a blizzard alone was breaking under the weight of the one thing that was heavier than a storm, the gaze of the man who had hurt her. And then Lila looked past Mercer, past Braddock, past the judge, and the clerk, and the bailiff. She looked into the gallery. Boone was in the first row, his scarred hands resting on his knees, his gray eyes steady, not smiling, not nodding, not giving her any cue or signal or instruction. Just looking at her with the quiet, unwavering certainty of a man who had decided that whatever she said or did not say, whatever happened or did not happen, he would still be sitting in that chair when it was over. He would still be there. He was not going anywhere. Next to him, Cutter, arms crossed, jaw set. The vice president who had argued against this mission and then committed to it completely, because that was what you did when you wore the patch. You argued in private, and you stood together in public, and you did not flinch. Next to Cutter, Harlan, 61 years old, Vietnam, 2 wars, a lifetime of ghosts. His eyes were wet, but his back was straight, and he was looking at Lila with the expression of a man who was seeing himself at 8 years old, sitting in a different chair, in a different room, facing a different monster, and wishing with the desperate futility of 60 years of hindsight, that someone had been sitting in the gallery for him. Behind them, row after row. Leather, scars, Silence. 93 people who had chosen to be here. Not because they were paid, not because they were ordered, not because they would gain anything from it. Because a child needed to look into a room and see that she was not alone. And they had decided, each of them, individually, in the privacy of their own damaged hearts, that being that room was worth whatever it cost. Lila looked at them, all of them. And something happened in her face that the court reporter would later describe in her personal journal as the single most devastating thing she had ever witnessed in 23 years of transcribing testimony. The fear left. Not slowly, not gradually. It left the way a held breath leaves, all at once, in a rush, expelled from the body by something stronger than the force that had been holding it in. Lila turned back to the microphone. She sat up straight. Her hand stopped shaking. "He hits me," she said. Her voice was clear, small, but clear. It carried to every corner of the room. "He hits me with his hands and sometimes with his belt. He locks me in the closet when I cry. He tells me if I tell anyone, he'll make it, so I can't tell anyone ever again." She paused, swallowed. Her eyes were dry. "He hurt me the night of the storm. He hurt me bad. And I ran because I thought if I didn't run, he was going to kill me." The courtroom was silent. Absolutely, completely, devastatingly silent. The kind of silence that only exists when a room full of adults has been confronted with a truth so simple and so terrible that language has temporarily stopped working. Wade Mercer's face had drained of color. His hands gripped the edge of the counsel table. Braddock put a hand on his arm. Mercer shook it off. "She's lying," Mercer said. Not to the judge, not to the court, to the room, to the cameras he could feel beyond the walls, to the narrative that was collapsing around him in real time. "She's lying. She's a child. Children lie. This is... Mr. Mercer," Halloran's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "You will be silent or you will be removed." Mercer turned to the judge with an expression of betrayal so raw that for one moment the alliance between them was visible to everyone in the room. The unspoken contract, the shared dinners, the poker games, the understanding that certain things would be handled in certain ways. It was all there, naked and obvious, in the way Mercer looked at Halloran expecting support and finding none. Because Halloran had done the math. The cameras were outside, the documents were on the clerk's desk, the journalists were in the back row with their phones out, and the gallery was filled with 93 people who would never forget what they heard today and would never stop talking about it. The machine was exposed. The only question left was whether Halloran went down with it or stepped away from it in time to survive. "This court finds sufficient evidence of imminent danger to the minor child," Halloran said. His voice was hollow. The voice of a man saving himself. "Temporary custody is granted to the Ridgecrest County Department of Child Services pending a full investigation. The child will not be returned to the petitioner." Mercer exploded from his chair. Braddock grabbed his arm. Mercer shoved him back with enough force to send the attorney stumbling into the counsel table. The bailiff moved forward. 2 more security personnel came through the side door. Mercer pointed at Boone, his finger extended like a weapon. His face contorted into something that no longer resembled the PTA dad in the navy blazer. "This isn't over," he said. His voice was shaking, not with fear, with rage. The kind of rage that does not dissipate but compresses, grows denser, grows hotter, until it reaches the temperature at which rational thought combusts, and the only thing left is the pure white-hot need to destroy the thing that destroyed you. "You hear me, Ryder? This is not over." The bailiff escorted him out. The courtroom doors swung shut behind him. Through the narrow window in the door, Boone watched Mercer walk down the hallway, flanked by security, his shoulders rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, and Boone recognized the walk. He had seen it before, in combat. The walk of a man who had lost the battle and decided the rules no longer applied. Tally put her hand on Boone's arm. Her fingers were ice cold. "We won," she said. But her voice carried no triumph. She was watching the same hallway, reading the same walk. "We won the hearing." "That's not what he's thinking about," Boone said. Outside, the day had turned gray and heavy, the sky pressing down like a lid on a pot. The iron wolves filed out of the courthouse and stood on the sidewalk, and for the first time since this had started, something like relief passed through the group. a collective exhale, a loosening of shoulders, a handful of tight smiles and quiet words exchanged between brothers who had spent the last 4 days operating at a level of tension that none of them wanted to sustain. Boone did not share it. He stood on the courthouse steps and watched Wade Mercer get into a truck at the far end of the parking lot. A black truck. The same black SUV he had seen parked on the county road outside the compound the morning before. Mercer sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. Then he reached across to the passenger side, opened the glove compartment, and took something out. Boone could not see what it was from this distance, but he saw the way Mercer handled it, the weight of it, the familiarity, the mechanical checking motion that Boone's hands knew from muscle memory because he had performed it 10,000 times in the Marines. He was checking a firearm. Boone turned to Cutter. "Get everyone back to the compound. Now. Full lockdown. No exceptions." "Boone, he's armed, Cut. I just watched him check a weapon. He's not going home. He's not calling his lawyer. He's going to the compound." Cutter's face hardened into something that was not fear, but its close cousin, the recognition of violence incoming, the switch from peacetime thinking to wartime thinking that happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Go," Boone said. "Take Lila. Take everyone. I'll be right behind you." They rode. 31 bikes and 2 trucks. And the convoy tore through Ridgecrest at 60 miles an hour, blowing stop signs and red lights, the engine screaming in unison like a warning siren that the whole town could hear, but no one understood. Boone was in the last truck with Roach, driving fast on the county road, watching the rearview mirror for headlights that did not belong. They reached the compound at 11:40 a.m. Lockdown took 8 minutes this time, faster, tighter. The brothers knew the drill now, and the urgency in Cutter's voice when he called it had turned their movements from practiced to desperate. Gates chained, positions taken. Lila brought inside the main lodge and placed in the interior room with no windows, the room they used for church, for votes, for the conversations that could never leave the walls. Boone stood at the north gate and watched the road. The minutes stretched. Each one lasted a year. At 12:17 p.m., Roach's radio crackled. The brother on the workshop roof. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man reporting incoming fire. "Vehicle on the access road. Black truck. Moving fast. 1 driver. No passengers visible." Boone felt his blood slow down. Not speed up. Slow down. The way it did in combat. The way the body responds to mortal danger not with panic, but with a terrible, crystalline clarity that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only the essential, the target, the terrain, the distance, the decision. "Hold positions," he said into the radio. "Nobody engages unless I say." The truck came through the trees like a dark thought given wheels. It hit the north gate at 40 miles an hour, and the chain held for 1 second before the lock sheared and the gate burst inward, throwing gravel and sparks across the yard. The truck fishtailed on the frozen ground, overcorrected, and came to a stop 30 feet from the main lodge with its engine still running and its headlights blazing. The driver's door opened. Wade Mercer stepped out with a rifle in his hands. He stood in the compound yard in the pale winter light, the rifle held across his chest, his eyes scanning the buildings, the bikes, the men who were emerging from positions around the perimeter. His face was no longer the PTA father. It was no longer the concerned stepfather. It was no longer even the bully who had walked into an emergency room 4 nights ago smelling like whiskey and dominance. It was the face beneath all of those faces, raw, stripped, reduced to its most fundamental architecture. The face of a man who had spent his entire life controlling things and had just lost control of everything, and who had decided in the space between the courthouse and this compound that if he could not have the child, if he could not have the silence, if he could not have the world he had built on fear and sealed files and the complicity of men who should have known better, then he would burn down the thing that took it from him. "Give me my daughter," he said. His voice carried across the yard like a blade. "Give her to me right now." Boone stepped forward, out from behind the gate, into the open, hands at his sides. No weapon. Nothing between him and the rifle but 30 feet of frozen air and the full accumulation of everything he had become since the night he answered Evelyn Hart's phone call. "Put it down, Wade." "You took everything from me," my family, my reputation, my... You never had a family. You had a hostage. Mercer's hands tightened on the rifle. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale a white cloud that dissolved into the cold air. His eyes were wet, not with grief, with the particular kind of fury that lives on the other side of grief, in the place where loss and rage share a border. "I will kill you," he said. "I will kill every one of you." Behind Boone, the Iron Wolves had formed a line, not organized, not commanded. They had simply moved into position because that was what they were. A wall. Cutter on Boone's left, Roach on his right, Harlan somewhere behind them, his old hand steady, his old eyes clear. 30 men and women standing in the open because their founder was standing in the open, and they would not let him stand alone. "You're going to have to," Boone said. His voice was quiet, not calm. There was nothing calm about it, but quiet. The quiet of a man who had made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Because she's not going back. Not today. Not ever. And the only way you get to her is through every single one of us. Mercer raised the rifle. The shot split the morning in half. Boone felt it before he heard it. A punch, a rupture, a white-hot intrusion in the meat of his left shoulder that spun him sideways and dropped him to one knee on the frozen ground. His hand went to the wound instinctively, and his palm came away red, and the pain arrived a half-second later like a train hitting a wall. Total, overwhelming, the kind of pain that rewrites your entire nervous system in a single instant. He heard screaming. He heard boots on gravel. He heard Cutter's voice, raw and commanding, and Roach's voice, sharp with fury, and beneath all of it, beneath the chaos and the shouting and the sound of men moving fast in every direction, he heard the thing that cut through everything else. Lila's voice from inside the lodge, screaming his name, "Boone!" He pressed his hand against his shoulder and felt the blood running between his fingers, warm against the cold, and he looked up from the ground and saw Mercer standing 30 feet away with the rifle still raised, and he saw Cutter and 3 brothers closing on Mercer from the sides. And he saw the moment, the exact, precise, frozen moment, when Wade Mercer realized that he had fired his shot and the wall had not fallen. They were still standing, every one of them, and they were coming. Cutter reached Mercer first, not with a weapon, with his hands. 230 pounds of muscle and grief and 9 years of missing a daughter he could not hold. All of it channeled into a single motion that drove Wade Mercer into the frozen ground so hard the rifle flew from his grip and skidded across the gravel and came to rest against the front tire of a parked Harley 20 feet away. Roach was there a half-second later, pinning Mercer's right arm behind his back with the efficient brutality of a man who had spent years restraining wounded soldiers in field hospitals while mortar rounds fell outside. A third brother, a prospect named Judd, who was 24 and had not said more than 50 words in the 3 months since he started prospecting, dropped his full weight onto Mercer's legs and held them against the earth. Mercer thrashed. He screamed. He called them names that the frozen air swallowed before they reached the tree line. His face was pressed into the gravel, and his breath came in ragged animal bursts, each exhale a cloud of white vapor that dissipated into the morning like every other thing he had lost in the last 4 hours. His leverage, his network, his mask, the careful architecture of fear and silence that had protected him for years. 20 feet away, Boone was on the ground. The bullet had gone through the meat of his left shoulder, missing bone and artery by margins that a surgeon would later describe as improbable. But improbable did not mean painless. The pain was absolute. It filled his entire body the way water fills a sinking room, rising, unstoppable, drowning everything beneath it. His hand was clamped over the wound, and blood was running between his fingers in a steady stream that turned the frozen gravel beneath him dark and wet. His vision was narrowing at the edges, the compound shrinking to a tunnel of gray light and distant sound. Harlan was beside him. The old man knelt in the gravel with the stiff, careful movement of joints that had been ruined by 61 years of hard use and dropped to his knees anyway because kneeling was what the moment required. He pulled off his flannel shirt, the only layer between his leather cut and his skin, wadded it into a compression pad, and pressed it against Boone's shoulder with the steady pressure of a man who had field-dressed wounds in jungles older than some of the men in this compound. "Stay with me, son." Harlan's voice was quiet. The word son was not a slip. He had never used it before, but it was the word that came, and he did not take it back. "Lila," Boone said. The name came out thick, wet, spoken through the pain the way a swimmer speaks through water. "She's inside. She's safe. Nobody gets past that door." "The shot." She heard the shot. "Marta's with her. She's okay. She's okay, Boone." Boone closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the world was red and black and pulsing. He heard sirens in the distance. Someone had called 911. One of the old ladies, or maybe Claire Dunmore, who was still in the compound with a phone, and the instincts of a woman who had spent years inside a system that was slow to act and had finally decided to make it act fast. The sirens grew louder, multiplied, became a chorus that cut through the compound silence like an alarm clock ending a long and terrible dream. 2 county sheriff's cruisers arrived first, then a state police unit, then an ambulance that bounced up the gravel road with its lights flashing and its sirens screaming and came to a stop in the yard next to the truck that Wade Mercer had driven through the gate. The paramedics reached Boone in under a minute. A woman with short red hair and steady hands cut his shirt open and assessed the wound and said words that he heard but did not process. Through and through, no arterial involvement, need to manage the bleeding, pressure, IV, let's move. They loaded him onto a stretcher. He grabbed the edge of the stretcher with his good hand and tried to sit up. "I'm not leaving." "Sir, you have a gunshot wound." "I know what I have. I'm not leaving until I see her." The paramedic looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the paramedic. Some unspoken negotiation occurred between them, the kind that happens between people who both understand stubbornness and have learned that certain battles are not worth fighting. 2 minutes, the paramedic said. Marta brought Lila out of the lodge. The girl was shaking, her whole body vibrating with the kind of tremor that comes not from cold, but from the chemical aftermath of terror. The adrenaline dump that floods a child's system when a gunshot shatters the morning, and the only person who has ever made her feel safe is on the ground bleeding. Marta had her arm around Lila's shoulders, holding her close, and Lila was letting her, which was its own kind of miracle because Lila did not let people touch her, had not let anyone touch her in years. And here she was pressing into the side of a woman she had known for 4 days because the body knows what it needs, even when the mind is too damaged to ask for it. Lila saw Boone on the stretcher and stopped walking. Her face went white. Her eyes locked onto the blood on his shirt, the bandage on his shoulder, the IV line running into his arm. She stood 10 feet away and stared, and in her eyes was something that Boone recognized from the emergency room 4 nights ago. The look of someone who has accepted that the worst thing is about to happen, because the worst thing has always happened, because that is what life is. He held out his good hand, not reaching for her, not pulling her toward him, just holding it out, open, palm up, the way you hold out your hand to something that needs to come to you on its own terms. "I'm okay," he said. His voice was rough with pain but steady. "Looks worse than it is." Lila did not move. Her eyes were on the blood. The blood was the problem. Blood was the language of her old life, the thing that appeared after Wade's hands, the thing she cleaned from her own skin in bathrooms with locked doors, the thing that meant the next few days would be quiet, because the violence always exhausted itself and retreated into a temporary calm that was not peace, but only the absence of active destruction. "Lila," his voice again, quieter. "I got shot and I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. You understand me? I'm not going anywhere." She looked at his face, past the blood, past the pain, into the eyes that had looked at her from a metal chair in exam room 4, and had not lied, and had not promised anything he could not deliver, and had not used the soft, sweet voice that adults used when they wanted you to trust them before they had earned it. Those eyes were the same, unchanged, still gray, still steady, still carrying whatever lived behind them, the weight, the damage, the quiet ferocity that was not violence but its opposite, the willingness to absorb violence so that someone smaller did not have to. She walked forward, slowly, each step deliberate. She reached the stretcher and placed her hand in his, and her fingers were so small they barely covered his palm, and they were cold, and they were shaking, and he closed his hand around them gently. Gently, the way you hold something that has been broken so many times it has forgotten it can be held without breaking. And he held on. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Yeah." "A lot?" "Yeah." She looked at the wound. Then she looked at him. "You got hurt because of me." "No." His voice was firm, not loud. Firm the way bedrock is firm. The kind of firmness that does not need volume because it is built into the structure. "I got hurt because of him. Not because of you. You didn't do this. You didn't cause any of this. You understand?" She did not answer, but she did not let go of his hand. The paramedics loaded Boone into the ambulance. Lila watched the doors close and the vehicle pull away down the gravel road with its lights still flashing, and she stood in the compound yard with Marta's arm around her, and Cutter standing behind them like a wall made of leather and scar tissue, and she watched the ambulance disappear into the trees. Across the yard, 4 sheriff's deputies were loading Wade Mercer into the back of a cruiser. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His face was pressed against the seat. He was no longer screaming. He had gone silent. The specific silence of a man who has crossed every line available to him and has arrived at the place on the other side where there are no more moves, no more connections, no more sealed files, no more judges who play poker on Thursday nights. Just handcuffs and a back seat and the long, slow machinery of consequences that he had spent 4 years evading. Roach stood by the gate and watched the cruiser leave. He turned to Cutter. His face was drawn, exhausted, the adrenaline draining out of his body and leaving behind the hollow, shaky aftermath that soldiers know and civilians do not. "Is it over?" he asked. Cutter looked at the yard and the blood on the gravel, the tire tracks from Mercer's truck, the shattered gate, the brothers standing in small clusters with their hands in their pockets and their shoulders sagging with relief and fatigue in equal measure. He looked at Lila, still standing between Marta and the empty space where the ambulance had been. "The easy part is," he said. He was right. What followed took months. The machinery of justice, when it finally decides to move, does not move quickly. It grinds. It processes. It generates paperwork and depositions and court dates and continuances and motions and countermotions, and it requires a kind of patience that is different from the patience of standing in a blizzard or sitting in a courtroom. It is the patience of endurance, of showing up day after day to a process that was not designed for speed and was not designed for the people it claims to serve. Wade Mercer was charged with attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated child abuse, and criminal conspiracy. His trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution called 17 witnesses, including Evelyn Hart, Claire Dunmore, and a 22-year-old man named Derek Cahill, who flew from Portland to Ridgecrest to testify that 12 years ago, outside a bar in Shelton, a stranger in a leather jacket had beaten a man unconscious to stop him from hurting a child, and that the child had been Derek, and that he had never forgotten the stranger's face. Mercer was convicted on all counts. The sentencing hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge, a visiting jurist from the state capitol because Halloran was no longer available, sentenced Wade Mercer to 37 years in a state correctional facility. Mercer stood in the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him and listened to the sentence and said nothing. He had stopped talking weeks ago. The man who had once walked into an emergency room like he owned the county had been reduced to silence, and the silence was not the powerful kind. It was the silence of a machine that has been unplugged and is slowly winding down to nothing. Judge Raymond Halloran was removed from the bench pending an investigation by the State Judicial Conduct Board. The investigation expanded within weeks to include the State Attorney General's office, which had received Claire Dunmore's tip 6 months earlier and had sent a man to her apartment to tell her it was being handled internally, which it was not. 3 county officials, including Dale Harkin of the Board of Supervisors, resigned before the investigation reached them. Carl Braddock surrendered his law license rather than face disbarment proceedings. Bridgewater Holdings was dissolved, its financial records subpoenaed, its transactions traced through 4 shell companies to a network of payments that had funded the suppression of child abuse cases across 2 counties for nearly 5 years. 7 children. 7 sealed files. 7 names that had been buried under paperwork and complicity and the particular kind of institutional cowardice that allows systems to fail the people they were built to protect. The files were unsealed. The names were read into the public record. One of those names was Mackenzie Pruitt, who had died at 14 in a foster home that a judge had sent her back to, and whose cause of death had been listed as cardiac arrest, because listing the truth, that she had been beaten to death in slow increments over a period of months, would have required someone to admit that the system had killed her. Claire Dunmore testified before a state legislative committee. She wore the same dark coat she had worn in the diner the night she met Boone, and her hands still shook when she spoke. And she spoke for 47 minutes without stopping. And when she was finished, 3 members of the committee were openly crying, and the chairwoman called a recess because she could not continue. Evelyn Hart continued working at Ridgecrest General. She did not give interviews. She did not seek recognition. She went back to her 18-hour shifts and her cold coffee and her quiet, stubborn refusal to look away from the things that came through her emergency room doors. The only change was a small one. She pinned a photograph to the corkboard behind her station. A photograph of a girl with brown hair and a yellow-green bruise on her jaw, sitting at a long wooden table in a place Evelyn had never been, eating scrambled eggs. Tally won the case. She won it with documents and testimony and the kind of relentless, furious competence that had made her the best trial lawyer nobody in Ridgecrest wanted to hire. She also won something else, though she did not recognize it as a victory at the time. She won the conversation she had told Boone was her price for helping. It happened 3 weeks after the trial, on a Thursday evening in the workshop of the compound where the light was bad and the space heater clicked and the air smelled like motor oil and cold metal. She talked for an hour. Boone listened. He did not interrupt. He did not deflect. He did not retreat into the silence that had been his armor for 15 years. He sat on an overturned crate and looked at her and heard every word, and when she was finished, he said 3 things. "I'm sorry. You deserved better. I'm not going to be different overnight, but I'm going to try." They were not perfect words. They were not enough. But they were true. And truth from a man who had spent his life hiding from it was a currency that Tally understood the value of. She did not move back to the compound, but she stopped leaving. Boone's shoulder healed in stages. The bullet had done clean damage, through and through, like the paramedic said. But clean damage to muscle and tissue still meant weeks of restricted movement, physical therapy sessions in a clinic in the next town, where a therapist named Gwen made him do exercises with resistance bands, while she asked him questions about his range of motion, and he answered in grunts and single syllables until the day she asked him how the kid was doing, and he talked for 10 minutes straight, and neither of them acknowledged that it was the most words he had spoken to a stranger in years. The scar it left was small, a puckered circle of pink tissue on the front of his shoulder, a matching one on the back. It joined the others, the white line along his jaw, the crossed mark on his nose, the marks on his knuckles that had never fully smoothed, and became part of the geography of a body that had been recording damage for 45 years and had never once considered the recording a reason to stop. Cutter restructured the club's decision-making process. He drafted new bylaws, written in longhand on yellow legal paper because Cutter did not trust computers, that required a majority vote of patched members before any operation involving legal risk. Boone signed them without argument. The bylaws were posted in the workshop on the wall next to the fuse box, and beneath them someone, nobody would admit who, had taped a handwritten note that read, "This means you, Boone." Roach traced the final threads of Bridgewater Holdings with the methodical patience of a man disassembling a bomb. He turned everything over to the state attorney general's office, which, under new leadership and significant public pressure, actually acted on it. He kept one copy of everything in a fireproof safe in the compound workshop because Roach trusted systems the way a man trusts a dog that has bitten him before, carefully, conditionally, and with one hand free. Harlan did not change. He was 61 years old and had been exactly who he was for a long time, and he saw no reason to become someone else now. He continued to ride his rebuilt Road King. He continued to drink his coffee black. He continued to sit on the porch of the mess hall in the mornings and watch the sun come up through the pines with the expression of a man who had made peace with the things behind him and was content to watch the light move across the things in front. The only new thing was Lila. She started sitting with him in the mornings, not speaking, just sitting, the way people sit together when they have discovered that shared silence between 2 wounded individuals can be a form of conversation that words are too clumsy to replicate. The custody process took 4 months. Temporary placement with Child Protective Services lasted 3 weeks before a caseworker, a new one, hired after the investigation, recommended foster placement with a vetted family in the county. Tally challenged the recommendation. She filed for permanent guardianship, then amended the filing to something more permanent than that: adoption. The paperwork was staggering. Background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations, financial disclosures, character references, court appearances. Boone submitted to every one of them with the grim endurance of a man navigating a bureaucracy that he did not trust, but had decided to work through rather than around, because Tally had explained to him in the workshop on a Tuesday night that the only way to give Lila a future that no one could challenge was to build it inside the system, brick by legal brick, until it was unassailable. His criminal record was the obstacle. It had always been the obstacle. The assault conviction from 2014, the plea deal, the 18 months served. Braddock's ghost, lingering in the paperwork. But Derek Cahill's testimony changed the narrative. The young man flew back to Ridgecrest for the adoption hearing and sat in the witness chair and told the court that the man sitting at the respondent's table had saved his life when he was 10 years old, and that the system had punished that man for it, and that he had spent 12 years wondering what happened to the stranger with the scarred knuckles, and that finding out he was still protecting children was the only thing about the justice system that had ever made sense to him. The judge, the same visiting jurist who had sentenced Mercer, approved the adoption on a Wednesday morning in June. The courtroom was small. The gallery was not. The Iron Wolves filled it again, the same way they had filled it in January, except this time the tension was gone. And in its place was something that leather and engine noise and years of compound living could not quite conceal. A fragile, tentative, hard-won joy that none of them were practiced at showing, because joy was not a skill that most of them had been given the opportunity to develop. Boone signed the papers with his right hand because his left shoulder was still stiff. The pen was a cheap ballpoint that the clerk had pulled from a drawer, and it skipped twice on the signature line, and his hand was trembling, not from pain, not from fear, but from the specific kind of tremor that occurs when a man who has spent his entire adult life convinced that he does not deserve a family is handed the legal proof that he has one. Lila watched him sign. She was sitting next to Tally, wearing a dress that Marta had bought for her, the first new piece of clothing she had owned in longer than she could remember. Her hair was brushed, her bruises were gone, the ribs had healed, the welt on her back had faded to a thin line that would eventually disappear entirely, though the marks that did not show on skin would take longer, and some of them would never disappear at all, and that was something both of them understood without needing to say it. "Is that it?" Lila asked when Boone set the pen down. "That's it. So you're my—" "Yeah." He could not say the word. Not yet. The word was too large, too heavy, too loaded with everything he had never had and had never believed he would become. But the word existed now, written in ink on a legal document, filed with the county, recognized by the state, and no one, no judge, no lawyer, no shell company, no sealed file, no man with a belt and a locked closet could take it away. The compound in summer looked nothing like the compound in winter. The razor wire still glinted on the fence, and the workshop still smelled like diesel, and the gravel yard still bore the scars of tire tracks and boot prints, and the dark stain near the lodge entrance that no amount of rain had fully washed away. But the pines were green now, deep and full, and the sky was the kind of blue that only exists in places far enough from cities to remember what blue looks like. Wildflowers had pushed up through the gravel along the fence line, small, stubborn, completely unauthorized by anyone, growing because that is what living things do when the conditions shift from hostile to survivable. On a warm evening in late June, Boone sat on the porch of the mess hall and watched the sun go down through the trees. His shoulder ached. It would always ache, the way old wounds do when the weather changes or the body remembers. But the ache had become familiar, a part of him, another scar added to the collection. He was drinking coffee from the chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Mechanic." The coffee was terrible. It was always terrible. He drank it anyway because some things do not need to be good to be necessary. The compound was alive around him. Bikes were parked in rows along the workshop, their chrome catching the last light. Cutter was at the grill behind the mess hall, turning burgers with the focused intensity he brought to everything, his silver-chinned beard catching smoke. Roach was sitting on the workshop steps, tossing a tennis ball for Diesel, who retrieved it with the enthusiastic incompetence of a dog who had never quite mastered the concept of bringing things back. Harlan was in his usual spot at the far end of the porch, his Road King parked beneath him like a throne, cup of coffee in his scarred hand, watching the light. Tally was at the long table inside the mess hall, her laptop open, working on a case for another family in the next county. A mother trying to get her children back from a foster system that had failed them the way foster systems fail quietly, through neglect and understaffing and the slow erosion of attention that happens when there are too many cases and too few people who care enough to fight. She had not gone back to her apartment. She had moved her legal files into the main lodge 3 weeks ago and had not discussed it with Boone, and Boone had not asked, and the absence of discussion was not the old silence, the silence that had been a door, but a new kind of quiet, the kind that exists between people who have decided to occupy the same space and are still learning the architecture of what that means. Lila came out of the lodge carrying a piece of paper. She walked across the porch to where Boone was sitting and stood beside his chair. She did not speak. She held out the paper. Boone took it. He looked at it. It was a drawing. A house. But this house was different from the one she had drawn in the mess hall 5 months ago, the one with no doors and black windows and crude figures wearing leather cuts arranged in a circle around a single small shape in the center. This house had a door. One door, centered on the front wall, drawn with careful attention to proportion and detail that showed the hand of a child who had been practicing. The door was open, not wide open, cracked, maybe a third of the way, letting in a wedge of yellow light that she had colored with a crayon worn down to a nub. The windows were not blacked out. They were clear, outlined in blue, and through them you could see shapes inside. A table, chairs, figures standing together. And on the roof, the same red flag she had drawn before, triangular, crude, defiant. But she had added something new. Outside the house, on the ground in front of the open door, she had drawn a row of motorcycles, small, careful, imperfect shapes that were unmistakably bikes, lined up in a row, parked and waiting. Boone held the drawing and looked at it for a long time. The sun was behind the pines now, throwing long shadows across the compound, turning the gravel to gold. The air smelled like burgers and pine smoke and the particular sweetness of warm earth after a long winter. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried. But something happened behind his eyes that was close enough to crying that the difference did not matter. A burning, a pressure, a fullness that had no name and no outlet, and simply existed inside him, expanding to fill spaces that had been empty for so long he had forgotten they were there. "The door's open," he said. His voice was rough. Lila nodded. She leaned against the arm of his chair. Not into him. Against the chair, close enough to feel his presence, far enough to maintain the boundary she still needed, the small distance she kept between herself and the world that was slowly, painfully, incompletely becoming a place she could survive in. "I changed it," she said. "I see that. Because doors don't just let bad people in." She paused. The words came slowly, the way important words do when they are being assembled by someone who is 8 years old and has learned more about the world than most adults will learn in a lifetime. "They also let you out." Boone looked at her. She was looking at the sunset. Her face was calm, not the flat, calculated calm of the girl who had walked into the emergency room, the calm of a child who is beginning tentatively, with all the caution of someone who has been burned by hope before, to believe that the ground beneath her might hold. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, the way he did everything with her, gently, carefully, always leaving her room to pull away, always letting her decide how close was close enough. She did not pull away. She leaned into his hand, just slightly, just enough to feel the weight of it, and they sat there on the porch of the mess hall and watched the sun disappear and did not speak because they had reached the place beyond language. The place where two people who have survived the same kind of darkness recognize each other not through words, but through presence, through proximity, through the simple act of being in the same place at the same time and choosing to stay. Behind them, the compound hummed with the quiet sounds of evening, the grill sizzling, Diesel barking at something only he could see, Cutter's low voice telling Roach to stop overcooking the burgers, Harlan's coffee cup set down on the porch railing with a ceramic click. The iron wolves moving through the rituals of an ordinary evening. The rituals of people who had been through extraordinary things and had come out the other side not unchanged but intact, scarred but standing, damaged but still capable of the one thing that all the damage could not destroy. The capacity to choose someone, to choose them fully, to choose them permanently, and to stand in front of whatever came for them next with boots planted and shoulders squared, and the absolute unshakable certainty that the person standing beside you would not leave, because they had already proven it in the only way that mattered, not with words, not with promises, not with grand gestures or philosophical declarations, but with presence, with showing up, with being there when the storm hit, and still being there when the storm passed, and still being there on the ordinary, unremarkable evenings, when the sky was clear and the air was warm, and there was nothing to protect against except the slow, creeping fear that the good things might not last. They lasted. On the gravel road beyond the gate, a truck passed on its way to somewhere else, its headlights sweeping briefly across the compound and then moving on. The sound of its engine faded into the pine trees and disappeared, and the compound went quiet, and the sky went dark, and somewhere in a small room in the main lodge, on a bed with clean sheets and a pillow that smelled like laundry detergent, a girl who had once drawn houses without doors fell asleep holding a drawing of a house with one door open and motorcycles parked outside, and she slept through the night without waking, without flinching, without counting her own heartbeats in the dark. For the first time in as long as she could remember, and for every night that followed, she was home.